Beryl was a holy virgin, untouched by anyone, nothing. She was simply enchanting in appearance, but it seemed the lad didn't want her to remain so pure. So he offered her something different. Moreover, he told her not to do anything foolish, as he could command her, and gently stroked her head like a small child. But the man who was holding her by the legs began to apologize, so she turned her gaze away from him. But he approached, roughly taking her chin, saying she should only look at him and no one else. And threateningly, he said if she looked away, he'd make her look at him, but in a far rougher manner. But for Beryl, this was unacceptable, and the situation seemed absurd, so she told him he was just trash, useless to anyone. But it seemed to amuse the lad even more, and he said that such entertainment was not what she needed, before covering her mouth so she wouldn't speak or scream. For according to him, she needed to work with her mouth first, not her eyes. Nevertheless, the Virgin could recognize demons, and the temple also wanted to kill them and rid the world of them. Too many demons were hiding in the human world, which was unacceptable and dangerous. So the Virgin was the world's only hope. Therefore, the temple took 3 families with too much influence and power and handed them over to the Virgin Beryl for analysis. Only the Virgin could purify this world from demons. She was the one who could oversee and see them, and only she knew everything about everyone. Moreover, there was a day when the power of God was transferred to the Virgin for 1 day, so she could offer demons as a sacrifice and close the gates of hell. As a bonus, the Holy One could choose which family to enter and whom to marry. It was like a privilege for her. When asked what she could say about the families, the first person she pointed to was Duke Orobos. Although the family wasn't demonic, he seemed rather strange and suspicious to her, as if he was hiding something. Returning to the present, Beryl tried to find an escape, but for the Duke, it was amusing to toy with her this way. He rhetorically asked if she enjoyed the game, as it pleased him, so she was supposed to feel the same way. Now, in his opinion, it was her turn to play with him, as they both should have fun. But suddenly, something no one expected happened. Workers arrived and said that the Duke had done terrible machinations, and for his actions, he was called the Devil, and he was sentenced to death, although he was outraged by this. The girls ran to the Virgin, not understanding how this could have happened, trying to calm her down, telling her not to worry and asking what had happened. He was given some time to pack his things, as they were going to kill him, and everyone was calm, knowing that he would no longer be around. The girl finally thought she had escaped from him, although his face showed no emotion, as if he didn't care at all. She was happy. Someone reached out to help her up, but the Duke started shouting that no one could touch her but him. She didn't think she was destined for such a shameful death, and that he truly wouldn't leave her, ever, as fate had intertwined their lives. And suddenly, she was transported back in time, when there were others from the temple around her. They were all around her, and everything was still fine. She wondered what had happened, but it seemed the others didn't care, and they told Beryl that everyone was waiting for her decision, and she needed to focus. In her second life, she decided to choose the Ubar family, as Duke Ubar had been kind to her. But at that moment, she did not know that this man would want to sacrifice her as a fallen saint. He was the devil's worshiper, so she wanted to escape this fate in her life and quickly get to the temple. She started knocking on the temple doors, hoping someone would open. And the person who appeared asked who was treating the place so disrespectfully. But the man recognized the saint, so she explained that Duke Ubar had transformed into a demon and that she needed to be saved. But it seemed that these people had their own ideas. They wanted to kill her, as, in their words, Beryl had walked the path of evil and lost her power. And the only option was to offer her as a sacrifice, as only in this way could God grant them forgiveness and safety for others. It seemed like this was all that could happen, but as soon as her blood was spilled, she saw people emerging from hell. And one man, who was at the very front with green eyes, intrigued her greatly, though at the same time, he exuded coldness and danger. The most interesting thing was that the devil was actually Duke Baine, the one with those incredible green eyes. Beryl seemed to be stuck in an endless loop of life repeats, and she couldn't escape it. This was now her third life. Now she knew that the priests wanted to offer her as a sacrifice. It was like a person in the mask of a demon, or a demon taking the form of a human. But which of these was worse? But what she was sure of, and knew, was that the Baine family was demonic. And perhaps this was the answer to her question. If she chose him, it would be the same as walking straight into hell. so it was the best decision. She understood that if the two families weren't true hell, then she'd better choose the Baine family. And that's exactly what Beryl did. The priests began to sing, so that if there was a demon who had taken the form of a human, he would appear before the light. The Duke Baine's palace looked very beautiful and mighty, just like the other dukes' palaces. The duke himself sat in a chair, looking out the window at the street, when his assistant brought him some calculations. He then continued speaking, saying that there was a demon suffering from a lack of magical power. But Baine already knew who it was. And then Baine continued and said that the saint would probably come to them. Didn't the others feel that? But the other asked him if he was talking about the guest, to which Duke nodded positively and, with a hint of mockery, said that she would indeed come. Beryl was reading a letter, which stated that since they doubted the honesty of the Baine family, the family would serve her until she was certain. She was about to leave when one of the priests stopped her and told her not to worry, but to accept it as a holy war. Deep down, she was already disillusioned with this temple and was glad that the veil on her face hid her true emotions. Moreover, she agreed, saying that this desire should remain in their hearts and they should continue on the righteous path. In general, rumors were circulating among the people that demons who had been defeated by God had gathered in the world of humans to later return. And the Baine family took responsibility for the safety of people, as they were located in dark lands where these monsters appeared. So no one would have thought that they could be connected to the devil, as they were contributors to the empire since its beginning. But the Duke Baine's castle seemed to be a haven for demons, so the Virgin needed to be cautious. And besides, it was quite frightening. But she understood that she had chosen them herself, and it was the only way, and perhaps she wouldn't even have time to say anything before they killed her. She understood that she didn't want to die, and also why she had already been given a third life, as if she were playing some game and making mistakes each time. Beryl wanted to live, so as she was traveling to the Duke's castle, she had time to think about whether she could be useful to them so they wouldn't kill her. Then it occurred to her that she could also save them by saying they weren't connected to demons, although it would be easier for them to kill her. So, for herself, Beryl decided that she had to pretend not to know they were demons, and that she had ended up in real hell. Of course, she also considered simply fleeing the temple rather than choosing one of the families. But on the way, she had already seen the Kingdom of Night, which was under the watch of the Baine family, meaning she was almost there. Then a noise was heard, and someone stood before the carriage, asking if it was the saint's carriage. The coachman replied affirmatively and asked who they were. The men answered that they were knights of the Baine family, and that she had been ordered to be personally escorted to the Duke. The priests tried to brush them off, saying the saint couldn't have contact with another world before the wedding. But it seemed that Beryl thought it would be better if she went with them. So stepping out of the carriage, she thanked the Duke for caring about her. Saying that refusing would be impolite, she was about to leave with them when the priest continued to insist that it wasn't allowed. Beryl took matters into her own hands and explained to the priests that although the family was suspicious, they weren't demonic, and that she wouldn't refuse them, since only she could prove their guilt or otherwise, so they shouldn't interfere. All the priests were simply stunned, as she had always obeyed and not opposed the morally correct opinion before. She said she would go with the knights and they could return to the temple, promising to contact them later. This way, she had already shown her allegiance to the family. After waiting for the priests to leave, Beryl asked the knights to take care of her from that day forward. Some time passed before they reached the Duke's estate, and it was quite lavish, but Beryl was overwhelmed with anxiety. But suddenly, someone appeared near her and greeted her, and her heart froze in fear. Although she was sure no one was here, she had to act as though everything was fine and just greeted him. The young man greeted her and said he was the butler of this castle, and his name was Renove. But Beryl lingered her gaze on his clothing, as it was completely different from what she was used to seeing in the two other castles. It was strange to her that he wasn't dressed as elegantly as the others, but she simply waited for him to continue speaking. She waited and waited, but no one opened the door for her, so she decided to open it herself. But at the last moment, a knight opened the door, extended his hand, and said he would show her the way. Her thoughts were tangled, but Beryl tried to remind herself once again that this was just an ordinary family and nothing more. But in reality, things were far more complicated than the girl had thought, and the knight showed her the way. However, this was not just any knight, but a disguised duke who had managed to see that she had been living for a third consecutive life. The assistant told the duke that Beryl had arrived. Moreover, all demons possessed certain magical powers that had a strong influence on them. An exceptional ability of Velid von Vine was that he could see the end. the end of all life, and what might happen to people in the future. But usually, when he looked into a mirror or something like that, he could only see his own end, nothing more. He saw only one thing, that as he lost his sanity due to the lack of magical power in his savage fury, he would eventually turn into a monster. This would be the worst death imaginable. But he wouldn't die until he became the monster himself. And this very strong belief always led him to victories, and his sword, confident in immortality, was strong enough to subdue all the demons living in the house and beyond. Therefore, he was pleased with this visit, as he wanted to learn something new, and perhaps something very interesting for himself. He felt the saint was already approaching their home. Seeing her for the first time, he immediately realized that she had initially chosen the Baine family and made the worst mistake she possibly could. At first, he thought only a shell of the temple remained, but then he realized she was truly a saint. And although everyone else there was far from holy, she had not changed her faith. After this, he asked the assistant how things were going with the gates of hell, to which the assistant replied that they were slowly closing, and that the magical power coming from the people barely sufficed for survival. After that, the Duke fell into thought. His green eyes, the color of emerald, stared into the void. He understood that if the gates closed, they would lose the connection to the demons in hell entirely, and that could be very bad. He realized that the only way to open these gates was with magical power, but at the moment, he lacked the strength to do so, and he began thinking of what could be done. Furthermore, energy could generally be drawn from the negative emotions of people, such as fear, despair, sorrow, and others. But no matter how many fighters they created or how many quarrels they stirred among people, it wasn't enough to generate the energy required. Therefore, the best option would be for the saint to open the gates of heaven and then force people to fall into despair to steal their magical power. They decided to end the conversation there for now and go meet Beryl. But the assistant was surprised, as he hadn't expected that Baine would personally go to retrieve her. Baine simply asked, "Who else could it be if not him?" He changed clothes and went to meet the saint. Now, when he met the saint, she smiled at him and said that Duke Baine was a very kind man. But in reality, it was Duke Baine himself who greeted her, not a knight. Moreover, the Duke noticed how many deaths she had endured and realized this was her third life. But he couldn't foresee that she would die on the third time, as his magic insufficient to find out everything. Baine saw that once she had died as the wife of the Ouroboros family, another time as the wife of the Ubar family, and now, in her third life, she was his wife. And she knew that Baine was a demon, yet she still chose to come here. To him, it was a mystery. Why did she decide to come here if she understood she was entering a true hell? He had various thoughts. Perhaps she came with a sense of justice, to find evidence. After all, had she gone straight to the temple, they would have raised swords against her immediately. But he didn't sense any negative emotions from her towards demons. But his thoughts were interrupted by screams, the sounds of swords clashing, and someone began fighting. Beryl turned her head and wondered where this attack could be coming from and what was actually happening. She then asked the knight what was going on outside, as she looked frightened. The knight replied that it was better to stay here if she planned to stay long. But if she didn't intend to, she could, of course, check what was happening outside. Beryl thought that the answer was quite polite, but not entirely consistent, so she decided not to continue the conversation in that direction. Sitting in the carriage, she simply asked him if he would protect her, for Beryl was a little scared, but she understood that having lived through her third life, nothing could frighten her as it once had. He simply replied that of course he would protect her, and that it would soon be over, so she should wait for him. Beryl thought that in Baine's house, it was probably quite normal for there to be frequent attacks and such, as demons lived here, so what else could one expect? But she understood that in reality, it was the frost she feared, which made her feel so calm at this moment. Then, recalling his gaze, she thought that perhaps it was his words that had made her feel so much calmer, as though he was soothing her. But then she wondered, did they kill the frost demons, as their powers should be equal? She wasn't entirely sure, for after all, she was a saint, and knew only so much. Later, when she finally arrived at the duchy and it was all over, Baine's assistant invited her inside. She entered the castle, taking in all the beauty around her. She realized that, now that she had entered, there was no turning back. She remembered how she had first seen the corpses of monsters and how terrified she had been, and how difficult it was to maintain composure. She asked the assistant if the guest room was on the second floor. From the other lives she had lived, she had learned a great deal about aristocratic life, the layout of rooms, and so on. Although the assistant found this quite strange, he also remembered that typically the guest room was located on the first floor. But the man told her that it was on the third floor, which greatly surprised her, as this was not what she had expected. It felt unusual. But after a long pause, the assistant said they would move her to the first floor instead. She simply smiled and said that it was fine. The third floor was just inconvenient for receiving guests, and that it was perfectly normal. Then she remembered that this was just a common practice for demons. They could move rooms and things around as easily as vases. Moreover, she reminded herself that she must never show surprise, as that could be very disastrous. She tried to calm herself after seeing the strange tea being poured, which was not so light in color, but rather a reddish hue. The assistant poured her the tea, and she took it with a smile, thanking the young man. But the real intrigue began only after she drank the tea, for the assistant had been eagerly awaiting that moment. All the demons in the house understood that once the saint had arrived, a war might soon begin. After all, there were far too many events and matters that needed to be resolved. Furthermore, they all obeyed her, though indifferently. But the assistant needed to swiftly maintain his status as the strongest. In fact, the arrival of the saint had caused a great deal of unrest among the demons, and many had started to take an interest in her. One demon told another that the saint had indeed arrived. The girl said, "That's very strange." The man replied that everything had already been prepared for the saint, so it would be very entertaining. Furthermore, they all said together that this meant the war had begun. But what exactly they meant was still unclear. However, the Ranov told them all to calm down, as it was not like that at all. The others were outraged and began asking why not and what this meant. The assistant explained that the Duke had ordered them to meet the saint as their guest, not as an opponent. But the other demons cried out and asked how they could welcome her as a guest and not as an opponent. They were outraged, as they saw her as their enemy, not a guest. After all, she was essentially their adversary, their enemy, not a guest. Another demon started speaking, saying that guests could be of different kinds. There are those who need to be persuaded very clearly, but in his understanding, it was to beat them. In another case, one could intimidate the guest so they understood everything necessary and got what they needed, and then deal with the rest later. Another option would be to execute a guest. To him, this also seemed perfectly normal. Then he said that if the saint were to be included in this list, there would be no problem, and they would meet her properly, as a guest. But the assistant shouted and said that she was simply their guest, and that they should not touch her, at least for now. Furthermore, he had been given orders to hide any preparations for war. However, the demons did not understand how they should behave. Should they treat her like a regular noble family guest? Ranov, confirming their words, simply smiled at them and said that this was exactly what they had to do now. Then they began discussing what makes up a noble family. One demon girl said that the nobles had a butler and smiled. Another man said that Haim was perfect for this role and asked where he had gone. A crow, which had flown in from outside, said that he had gone to the battlefield half a day ago. But the other demons began to worry and asked who was the most beautiful among them to be the butler. They all began to bustle around and think about these questions, which seemed very difficult for them. After a little thought, the assistant said that most likely only he would be suited for this role, and that they should make way for him. Another man said that he is the most handsome here, while a third one asked if he could at least serve the tea. They even smiled at the assistant, but they had no better options. Renovi replied that all they needed to do was pour some water there and not worry about it. However, another one immediately screamed that it would be an insult to the drink and that they should not serve it that way. He also asked to call the cook. But others said that Varese had been sent away because he had served some strange food to His Highness and then was sent off. After this, the assistant ordered all the demons to throw out the hideous things standing in the hallway, as they needed to clean up, since all this junk did not look very good. Additionally, they were to remove the magical cannon that was also standing in the hallway, which clearly did not belong in a noble family's house. But another cheeky demon approached, calling the assistant Renov, and said that perhaps the head of the monster wouldn't hurt them, showing it to him. He added that they needed to create a more frightening atmosphere for the girl. But the assistant yelled at him again, saying that she was their guest and that he should calm down. He added that this was the result of his 200 years of work. However, it seemed the demons still didn't understand what the problem was and what the meeting with the guest actually meant. What were they supposed to do? Renov was beginning to understand that it seemed only he and the Duke in this castle understood human traditions, as it appeared the others were completely clueless. It seemed they had done everything perfectly. The man had even learned to serve tea, and now he simply stood behind the girl, watching her drink. In his thoughts, he wondered if they really resembled an ordinary noble family, since he had tried so hard to make it so. But then he remembered the situation with the guest room and realized it was very strange that it was not on the first floor. Then Runaway asked how Beryl liked the tea. She, finishing the whole cup, said that it had quite an unusual taste. In her thoughts, she wondered why it was so salty. She wasn't used to such tea and had never drunk anything like this before. But the man seemed very satisfied with his work, thinking that it was a good sign that the girl had appreciated the tea. So he told her that she should drink more of it in that case. But she thought to herself that she couldn't drink this salty water anymore, since it tasted absolutely awful. Then Ranave poured himself some tea and started drinking, and he seemed to really enjoy it. But the girl looked at him very strangely. First of all, she didn't understand how the water wasn't hot for him, and secondly, she noticed that there wasn't even steam rising from the cup. She also wondered how he could drink such salty tea. But then she remembered that after all, he was a demon, and of course, they had different tastes. Then she coughed a little and almost spat out the whole tea. The man stood up and almost shouted if the girl was having any problems. Beryl replied that it seemed she just wasn't used to the peculiarities of the Baine family. But the man continued trying to appear very splendid and modern, offering her some cookies to try. The girl hoped that after such salty tea, these cookies would taste delicious to her and help her somewhat mask the taste of the tea. He pushed the plate towards her, and she took one. He told her not to be shy and take more. But after biting a small piece, she was shocked to find that these cookies were extremely spicy, and she didn't understand how such a thing was even possible. The next moment, she started coughing, and he became worried, asking if everything was okay with her. The next moment, she caught herself thinking that pretending not to know they were demons would actually be very difficult, considering the extremely salty tea and the overly spicy cookies. Then, a servant came to the Duke and told him that the saint was looking for him and calling him for some questions. This was incredibly strange, because even though she didn't know she was in the den of demons, she was still calling the strongest devil here. But he understood that she was probably still nervous, because first of all, it was a new family. Everything was unusual, a new environment, a new atmosphere. But he had no idea that she understood what was happening here. In the next moment, he decided to look into the mirror and see what awaited him, what kind of death it would be. Now he saw himself dressed quite unusually, lying on some roses in a garden, it seemed. He looked and saw a girl without a face. He couldn't make out her face, but the next moment, the mirror cracked. Everyone screamed and asked if the Duke was all right. A wound appeared on his face, and it started bleeding. He realized that his final moment had changed. It wasn't the same as before. Usually, he had seen that he would lose his mind and become a monster. But now it was different. He told Helvis that this had changed, and that he didn't understand why. Helvis asked if everything had gotten better, to which the Duke replied that he couldn't see his death. He had just seen a moment. Furthermore, he noted that this meant either his death was still far away, or there were too many different ideas about how he would die. Helvis asked him what they should do with the saint next. After all, they had hidden all the weapons, but at any moment they could return to combat readiness. He said this as if waiting for a confirming decision, but he didn't hear one. The Duke simply told them to stand down from preparations for war and recalled the girl in his memory, her image, and the fact that her name was Beryl. But Helvis was shocked by the Duke's response and asked what all this meant and why the Duke wanted to stand down from combat readiness. The Duke simply said that for now, he just wanted to observe the girl. If she could affect his future, then maybe it would be for the best. After all, the magical power they needed to sustain their lives was first passed to the strongest among them, that is, the Duke. And he understood, although he was the strongest of the demons, that he couldn't ignore the fact that he would also become a monster. And this meant that the demons would be destroyed by the lack of magical power. But if the future had changed with the arrival of the saint, then perhaps it was worth considering. Helvis continued to say that if they didn't do anything, they would be quickly exposed, and something had to be done about it, since she most likely had already noticed something strange. The Duke simply agreed with this thought, but it seemed Helvis was not satisfied with that, and the next words of the Duke shocked the man, as he said that she already knew who they were. Furthermore, he said that she should stay here, as he needed to know why she had come here. Helvis couldn't believe this. It was very hard for him. The Duke simply ordered him to continue pretending to be human, to observe the saint's reaction, how she would behave. Even if it didn't go very well, they still needed to keep up the act. Furthermore, even if the situation seemed too absurd, the saint would have no other choice but to reveal her true intentions to them, and they would finally resolve this. Beryl was a bit nervous, so she decided to take a walk in their garden at night. She was very curious about how things would turn out and if everything would be fine. After all, a noble wedding, especially one arranged by demons of the highest rank, was very unusual. The assistant had initially reassured her, saying everything would be fine, but she still felt uneasy. But she knew that if he had been an aristocrat, he would never have hung a bloody tapestry in the bride's room. After this, the assistant noticed where the girl was looking. He began to deny it a little and said that the Duke had brought it as a trophy and suggested they just take a walk in the garden. They walked around and everything seemed normal. But she understood that the oddities didn't end there. In the street, there was a demon who seemed to be contemplating whether to be or not to be, and the saint noticed him, though he seemed a bit shocked. At first, she thought it was a gardener, but then she realized that the young man was just admiring the flowers. Another man, who appeared at the window, was roasting meat but was muttering to himself about why it was cooking much longer than human meat. Hearing this, the girl asked, "What did you say?" He was slightly shocked. He began to deny it and said that what he meant to say was that it was cooking longer than he thought. It would actually be very hard for her to pretend that she didn't know anything, as these people were incredibly strange, although they were demons, so it was convenient for them. Then she realized that there was something strange and interesting at the same time in this place. It was that here, there was both day and night, and the sky was covered with stars. For some time, the demons would illuminate the mansion, and then they would plunge it into darkness, almost as if following a schedule, maintaining a human-like cycle. That is, they themselves created day and night here, almost as a schedule, to make it appear as if everything was normal. The girl spoke it out loud. But then someone abruptly pulled the girl out of her thoughts, and she turned around suddenly. She saw again the knight in the mask, the one who had accompanied her in the carriage. The man asked if she was impressed by such a decision of theirs. She said yes, because it was very strange to her here, and she was impressed by the fact that they created daylight. But she remembered the boy Nabarus, who had met her with a knife, and she was very glad to have seen someone familiar to her. The knight began to explain to her that this light was created from moonlight, and that this light had been collected during the night, and it was then combined with precious stone during the day. The girl was shocked and made a very cute face. The man asked her if she preferred brighter places. Then the Duke removed his knightly armor, the mask, and stood before the girl as he really was. She froze for a couple of minutes and just stared into his eyes, as she didn't understand what was happening. And it seemed that he had changed his hair color when he was wearing the mask, so the girl wouldn't have recognized him if she had seen him without the armor. He had silver-colored hair before, so she didn't quite get the joke about his hair. But she realized that he had changed his hair color. The man explained that people who come from other places are often frightened by the eternal night. But the girl understood that, since demons have many different abilities, it wasn't difficult for them to create an eternal night. Furthermore, he asked the saint if perhaps she preferred brighter places and didn't like this one, or if she was generally scared here. She didn't fully understand the question, so she simply said that she wasn't scared, although she did wonder if there was some hidden meaning behind his words. But he continued, saying that night provokes unnecessary fantasies and unease. Beryl thought for a moment and said, no, it wasn't like that for her. She just felt like she was being pulled into sleep, that's all. She understood that in the temple where she had been, there wasn't a single drop of shadow where she could hide her thirst and darkness. Moreover, Beryl continued, saying that the things darkness makes us imagine are not always bad. Sometimes it helps us hide what we don't want to show others, so she added that she liked the night. But the man decided to press on and asked if this place didn't seem devilish to her, which was why she chose it. And here the girl started to think that this knight was someone unknown, because she had never seen him in any family photos. But still, she continued, saying that she couldn't just understand, purely by words, whether this family was devilish or not. The man knew she was lying, so he just thought it was quite foolish, and that she was a good actress. Beryl continued, saying that in the temple, it was so bright that it was almost impossible to fantasize or to dream. That's why she chose this place, thinking she could dream here and learn to want something. Because the night makes us think and dream about something. Valed silently stood, looking at her, reflecting on her words, and wondering if she was speaking the truth from the heart or not. Then the Duke asked, since she wanted to dream, did that mean she wanted to learn how to control her desires? Or was it like that? She realized that he was too straightforward and said that she would like to meet the man who would become her beloved husband in the future, and asked if he had returned. The man, throwing off his mask, said, "Of course." But the girl didn't understand such a gesture and asked if he could take her to him. The Duke said it was unnecessary and moved closer to her, making her take certain actions. But as he leaned even closer, he said that her husband would be him, so there was no need to take her to him. He also asked how he should address her. Should he call her Saint Beryl or just Beryl? Or maybe she wants him to call her his wife. She hesitated for a moment, thought about it, and said that he could just call her Beryl. He also introduced himself, saying his name was Veled von Vine. Now she finally realized that the knight who had accompanied her carriage was the very same Vine. This was quite unexpected for her, but at least now she knew that she was definitely safe. In fact, she was just afraid that, like her other two former husbands, he would begin to behave aggressively once she arrived at his duchy. Moreover, he was quite curious as to why someone like her, after leaving the temple, immediately started looking for him, as this was quite inappropriate considering she was their saint. She said that she was planning to give this marriage much more significance than just searching for a devilish family. Furthermore, she added that most likely the priests wouldn't approve of her decision, but at this point, she had nothing to lose. He asked what she had in mind, as her words didn't quite make sense to him. She told him that she wanted this marriage to be real, and she also wanted to get to know the man she was going to marry and spend her life with. She acted quite convincingly, so he believed her, thinking she was sincere. He continued and said that he thought she might just be suspecting him. Beryl said that she could tell who the devil was, but she could also say that the person wasn't one as well. She also mentioned that for the Baine family, this was a pretty good option. But the Duke seemed not to trust her, and asked if she was really fine with him being her husband, getting even closer to her. But for Beryl, he was standing too close, so she pushed him away and realized she didn't know what to say to him about that. However, Vine just smiled and said that he would put all his efforts into it. He then said that he had some matters to settle in the meantime. Furthermore, he added that their next conversation could be held in a more private and secluded place. But to the girl, this sounded quite rude and crude. Yet, for some reason, her thoughts immediately went to the fact that he was probably referring to their first wedding night. But it seemed that the man didn't want to leave just like that. And he added that he knew she had spent her whole life in the role of a saint. Did she know anything about nocturnal matters? Because, as he had heard, the temple taught one to control their desires. And it seemed to him that this was true. The girl became too confused and didn't know how to respond at first. But he added that since she had said she wanted to learn to desire, he would help her with that. At the same time, he kissed her hand. He said that he would teach her on their first night. Moreover, he added that he would give her something even the gods wouldn't want to remember. The next day, the sun was shining brightly outside the window. The demons were discussing how the ceremony seemed too simple. And it seemed, since everything was entrusted to the temple, that everything was too simple and poor. But another one said that since it was being held by them, everything needed to be perfect, and they would take care of the ceremony themselves. However, the assistant, Renove, told the others not to touch anything, as it seemed that the saint liked everything as it was and didn't want anything changed. Moreover, if they didn't want to be exposed, it was important to stay in the background and not change or touch anything. In the carriage, Beryl realized that she wanted him to come with her. But unfortunately, it wasn't going to happen. Another girl sitting in the carriage told her that the Duke had gone to deal with monsters, so he wouldn't be able to join her. Moreover, during the ceremony, he had to be with her, so there was no other way. She said that the wedding dress for Beryl had arrived from the temple. But in reality, it was far from beautiful. It looked as simple as possible, and if it weren't for the veil, no one would have thought it was even for a bride. She asked if she liked her dress, and Beryl honestly replied that she didn't like it. But the girl seemed a little shocked, so Beryl thought maybe she had said something wrong. But the girl just understood her and told her to follow her. She led her to a room and showed her another dress, much more beautiful, fuller, with decorations and more. This dress had been prepared by the Duke for Beryl. Beryl, looking at it, gasped with joy, as it looked incredible. But it seemed as though a voice in her head told her that a saint should be without luxury, and so should her wedding. For a moment, it felt like it was the voice of a priest from the temple. In her first life, she couldn't endure the great luxury of Duke Orobos. That's why she once went to another wedding in another family. Looking at the dress, she asked herself the question, how could one have the opportunity to marry in such a dress? But now she understood that she could wear a beautiful dress herself and that this was her opportunity, even though everyone at the temple was against it. But she would like to do what she felt, what she wanted. So she just couldn't take her eyes off this incredible dress. Although deep inside, she still had questions. Would this be considered a transgression for the temple? A desire to wish for something that wasn't granted to her, something she wasn't allowed to desire? But as soon as the girl thought about desire, she immediately remembered yesterday's conversation with the Duke about the first wedding night and everything else. She thought for a moment, but the other girl called out to her, so she said that she would take it and wear it. 2 days before the wedding, a priest from the temple came and told the girl that she should consider not wearing anything too extravagant, as her task was just to find the devil. Beryl didn't agree with this option, and she said that if she didn't find the devil, she would just stay with the Duke and live an ordinary life. But the priest was shocked by her response. She then simply answered the priest that she wanted to dress beautifully because she didn't know if this was her last life or what, and his opinion wouldn't change her desires and actions. The priest finally just said that God would watch over her. Later, Beryl burst into the room with the assistant and another demon, asking them to decorate the ceremonial hall as lavishly as possible. She decided that this might truly be her last life, and this time, it would be the last one. So she needed to live it to the fullest, the way she truly desired, and not just be a puppet of the temple. For in the beginning, the devil was a human. To be more precise, a human who knew how to use magic. But in addition, God placed a curse on people who used magic because they didn't want to rely on him, to place their hopes in him. And it was after this that the devil was born. But for the hero, it was so funny that the saint, who seemed to bathe in God's love, broke his rules. And now she was living her third life. Although all of this was meaningless, he actually liked illogical things. Looking at the fact that he had lived for a long time in a cursed body and couldn't change anything, he also felt some kind of stress in his soul, as he wasn't used to this at all. But even then, when he disguised himself as a knight and went after the saint, he didn't feel any significant emotions. But now, he had begun thinking about her far too often. After joining with her, his fear of death only intensified, although this was actually very strange. It was as though he wanted to completely absorb her emotions, for he was incapable of controlling his desires. Therefore, he needed to return quickly and see what would come of it. After dealing with the monsters, he returned and was greeted by his assistant, Ronov. Ronove asked if it was normal to go fight monsters during the wedding ceremony, or before it. The Duke simply replied that now, for a while, there would be peace. Then he asked if the suit was ready. The assistant answered positively and said he could bring it right away. He also asked how the process was going, to which assistant replied that the saint had interfered with the process, which shocked him. He couldn't understand how she had wanted to make everything more luxurious, and why, when just a few days ago she hadn't wanted this at all, and that it was quite unexpected. The demons seemed to have gathered to discuss and express their opinions on why the saint was doing this. But one of them said that it didn't really matter because they didn't want to listen to the temple either. So he ordered them to just decorate the grandest hall, so that this quarrel would show the full luxury of the Duke and his power and wealth. And then, suddenly, the saint arrived with her assistant. All the demons fell silent and didn't understand what she was doing there. But she was happy to be there, as she realized that they didn't know how to decorate halls and, in general, how humans did it. She said that since it was her wedding, she would take care of the decoration of the hall. But someone said that since she was a human, how dare she command them what to do, that she would do everything herself. But Beryl was already prepared for such an answer, as she had heard that demons only obey strength. So she said that soon she would be the mistress of the duchy, and how, as the future wife of their duke, could she not even decorate the hall for her wedding? The assistant tried to smooth things over and said that since many of them had simply been fighting in battles, they probably didn't know how or what to do. She agreed and said that she had thought so and simply wanted to help. She also mentioned that she had found evidence that he was a demon. And in addition, if the priests from the temple suspect anything, there will be big problems. Beryl added that she simply planned to decorate the hall with the fashionable trends of the empire so that the temple wouldn't suspect anything and no problems would arise. The assistant agreed and said that this was the way it should be. Another demon finally agreed with her and said that the others should just gather everything again and put it in the carriage. Meanwhile, the assistant was exactly repeating the woman's words and said that she said she would be the Duke's wife and they must follow the orders. The young man, of course, wondered how she knew that everyone obeyed only strength, especially demons, to which he replied that she most likely heard it from Helvis, so she knew the rules by which they lived here. It seemed that Vine reacted to this quite calmly, although Ronave hadn't expected that. Then Vane, in a cheerful tone and with a smile on his face, said that it was time for them to go. When asked where, he replied, "Of course, to get married and to his bride, who is waiting for him." The wedding day arrived. A great many priests from the temple gathered in one place to celebrate and learn more about the Baine family. But they were too careless to discuss whether Duke Baine and his servants were demons in the presence of those same servants and Duke himself. 3 priests stood not far from the assistant and another demon and were discussing whether they could actually be demons, as demons supposedly could not control their desires. They also wondered how they could suppress their character if there were so many priests around. In addition, they discussed whether the saint could have made a mistake in her choice. Of course, the assistant and another demon wanted to have some fun with these priests, but unfortunately, they didn't have the chance at the moment. This was because there was an order not to kill anyone on the wedding day. After all, for demons, a command from a stronger demon is more important than any desire. Therefore, these foolish priests, in the assistant's opinion, didn't even realize how lucky they were. Another priest gave the saint water, Beryl, and told her that she had to sprinkle Duke Baine with it. And this was very important, and she must not forget it. The girl, thinking to herself, thought it would be better if she poured it over the priest's head. Another woman came and called the girl, saying that the ceremony would soon begin and they needed to go. For the saint, this was a chance to escape from this annoying priest, although he still shouted after her to make sure she didn't make a mistake and definitely sprinkled the Duke with the holy water. Seeing the whole hall, how beautifully it was decorated and how wonderful everything was, she was very happy. In addition, she was happy that she finally wore the luxurious dress, although it seemed that the priests didn't like it very much, her luxurious dress and, in general, all the decorations in the hall and so on. But the Duke himself didn't take his eyes off the girl. He was scrutinizing her. But she remembered the priest's words that she had to pour the water on the Duke's head. She recalled that in her first life, she had poured the holy water over Duke Orobo's head. In her second life, she had also sprinkled her former husband with this water. Those two were humans, so the holy water did not harm them, but this man is a demon. And as soon as the water touches his head, he will feel an intense pain. Moreover, black smoke will rise, and it will look as though he is burning, and everyone will understand that he is a demon. And after that, a war will begin. But the girl understood that she was not here by chance and had a plan, because the priests had urged her to pour this water, but she needed to do something else. The young man simply waited to see what she would do next, whether she would do what she was supposed to or not. Some time ago, she had made some changes to the ceremonial hall. She said she wanted to set up a podium here, if one was available. She also wanted to change its angle, otherwise she and the Duke would be too visible, and then they would have to change the wedding hall's layout. But of course, the demon named Nibirius didn't hide his displeasure from the girl. The girl simply continued and said that she wanted the Baine family, with whom she would live, to have a good view of the ceremony. Moreover, she clearly understood that as long as she had even a part of the Baine name, no demon could harm her directly. At least, not for now. So, he simply agreed to the girl's words and asked how exactly she wanted to do it. Returning to the present moment, she opened the flask of holy water. The next moment, she simply drank it, and everyone was in shock. The young man hadn't expected this, and his pupils slightly dilated. The girl slowly pulled the young man's face toward hers and gently kissed him. But in reality, she had only pretended that they kissed. In fact, she had placed her finger between their lips. Baine understood that something was supposed to happen here, because although other demons might not have known, he knew very well that humans had this tradition of sprinkling water. And if this was indeed a demon, it would be very hard for him to come out of this unscathed. But he didn't want to avoid it, as before coming to the wedding ceremony, he had looked in the mirror and understood that he wasn't going to die today. So, with a calm heart, he simply waited to see what the saint would do and what would happen next. After that, She moved away slightly and apologized to him, bowing her head. But he wasn't like her. He quickly pulled her toward him and kissed her sharply, this time for real, because only she could ignite this fire of desire in him. But this was clearly something the girl hadn't expected, because she had only wanted to pretend they kissed, and now he kissed her for real. She realized that it might happen that some holy water still remained in her mouth, so she wanted to end it as quickly as possible. But the young man didn't let her do that and deepened the kiss. The priests were in shock and didn't even know how to comment on this. Then suddenly, the assistant stood up and started applauding. After that, all the other demons stood up too. The priests also stood up and began to clap. They were all clapping because this scene looked incredible. But both sides knew that it wasn't just incredible. It was merely a cover. The newlyweds continued to stand at the altar, kissing under the sound of applause, oblivious to everything around them. The entire hall was filled with excitement, but for them, there was only this moment, when time seemed to stop. Then the man congratulated her on joining their family and smiled. Someone told the saint that the wedding banquet is being skipped. The priest continued, saying that a wedding was not just a walk in the park. It was a ceremony meant to reveal the demon. And even though Duke Baine had been declared a magical demon, the Baine family was one of the founders of the empire and had served the empire for many years. Canceling the banquet could damage their reputation, but the priest didn't care. So they announced that due to the saint's exhaustion, there would be no banquet. The girl understood what was going on, as she actually wanted to make this a real wedding. She understood that they likely just wanted to leave this place quickly, where there might be a demon. Although their duty was to fight demons, they were in fact very cowardly, hypocritical, and only thought about themselves and were afraid. Later, the young man asked what they would do. But Beryl decided that, since they could dispose of her name as they wished, she could do the same, and said that she hadn't said anything like that, and that the temple was probably using her to leave quickly. Then he went to the assistant and asked what they would do, as the Duke had also said to do what the lady wanted. After that, they decided to go at once to fulfill the wish of their new mistress. Then the Beryl approached Ranove and asked what exactly a banquet was, and whether it was connected with blood. In addition, the assistant realized that canceling the banquet was, first and foremost, a sign of disrespect to the Baine family. The assistant was initially too lost in thought to answer the young man, who kept asking what they should do. He then ordered him to just take down all the decorations from the hall and so on. Moreover, Ranove realized that the saint wasn't actually as foolish as she seemed. Perhaps she had noticed some evidence that Baine was a demon. Because of this, he didn't think there could be a battle at the wedding. But in reality, the saint had just saved the situation, even though she knew everything. However, remembering the events, the assistant realized that she had swallowed the holy water and kissed Duke Baine, yet nothing had happened to him afterward. And then he came to the thought that perhaps the intentions of the temple and the saint were too different, and maybe she didn't wish them harm. But then, why was this happening? And what exactly was she planning? This thought didn't let him rest. Moreover, he didn't know whether his lord was aware of all this, as Baine's thoughts were unknown to anyone. After the ceremonies were over, all the priests began to say their farewells and wished the girl happiness. Although their faces showed that they weren't exactly thrilled for her, she also said goodbye to them and was very happy that this test was finally over. Because although there was no direct proof that Duke Baine was a demon, it was clear that the priests didn't trust him. So it was for the best that they finally left and left her alone here. Although she didn't know what to expect now, the first thought that came to her mind was that she was now Beryl von Vine. At that moment, the Duke slowly walked up to her. He was dressed very elegantly and overall looked as he usually did. He repeated once more what her name and last name were and asked if she liked it. She thought that perhaps it was time to become the Duchess of Baine. She didn't even have time to respond to him as he, getting closer, spun her around in a passionate kiss. But she didn't understand how this man could be so calm, since this was their first conversation after that kiss. And wasn't it painful for him after the holy water? Even though it was a small amount of holy water, it most likely still got into his body. But she became so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't even hear when Baine called her several times by name. He stood by the carriage and said that it was time to go, asking if she was ready. She, looking at the carriage, was very surprised. Although it was black, it was the most luxurious one she had ever seen. The man offered her his hand and helped her into the carriage. In fact, although the carriage was black on the outside, inside he had decorated everything in white. He thought that she was used to white carriages at the temple. It was quite considerate and sweet of him. She appreciated it. But at that moment, a very interesting story came to her mind. When she first entered the temple, she wanted to walk in the snow. The beautiful white snow had covered the ground with a thick layer. She loved walking on it. She was completely enchanted. At that time, she was still a child, but suddenly, she heard the priests calling her, and she overheard them discussing her. In their thoughts, she shouldn't have been so reckless and acting like a child, even though she was still a child. The priests began to shout at the little girl, saying that the white snow was the sign of God, and she had no right to walk on it. After that day, she began to fear touching anything white. In fact, these memories greatly troubled the heroine. She felt uncomfortable whenever she saw the color white. The man noticed that something was wrong, and said that if she didn't like it, they could request a different carriage. She simply replied that everything was fine, but the incredible whiteness made her a little tense. After that, the man said that it was no problem if it bothered her and started adjusting something, though she couldn't see as she was standing behind him. A few minutes later, he stepped aside and said that if something was disheveled, they could still use it. In reality, he had just slightly disheveled the bedspread. She smiled childishly and sincerely and said that it was much better now, and she felt comfortable in her soul. After they arrived at the palace, another girl began to work a little on Beryl's hair. She did her hairstyle, makeup, and also helped her change her clothes. She then asked Beryl what she thought of her new look, to which she replied that she really liked it. Moreover, a few days ago, the girl was told that, according to the traditions of the Baine family, all the servants would wear veils for a week. This was to give the new mistress time to get used to them. But, to put it differently, it also meant that they should not witness the first week of the newlyweds. But the girl was very surprised and didn't understand. Wasn't the first wedding night just one night? Or would it actually last an entire week? The man smirked and explained that, over the 7 days, the spouses would spend no less than 3 nights together. Also, the servants were to behave as if they weren't there and move quietly. This meant that during this time, the mansion would be just for the two of them. It was also time to select new servants for the new mistress. And although the servants wouldn't be able to see the masters clearly, the masters would be able to see them well. After that, Beryl decided to ask what powers she would have and what she could do. The lead said that she was granted all the same powers as in regular noble families, but in addition, she was given absolute power to command and order. This meant that no one could disobey the Duchess's words, just like the Duke's, so she could do anything she desired. At this moment, it seemed to her as though she heard his inner voice when he said that he didn't behave like a demon, so she could act however she wished. Returning to the present, he also said that he would make sure she was comfortable and had everything she needed. He said they would see each other on their first wedding night. But for the girl, it felt quite unusual, and she was very anxious. She sat on the bed, just waiting, when the Duke knocked at the door and asked if he could come in. She agreed, and he slowly started entering. All she could think about was whether it was going to hurt a lot. After all, she wasn't a child anymore, so she clearly knew what happened between a husband and wife at night. But she hadn't experienced that with Duke Oribos, who showed strange lust toward her, nor with Duke Ubar, who saw her only as a victim. She hadn't spent a single night with either of them, and was very happy about it. From the very beginning, they had both been very unpleasant to her. The situation unfolding now was just as nerve-wracking for her as when she first ran through the snow. The man slowly approached her, but didn't sit on the bed, saying that she was very tense. She stood up from the bed and said it wasn't true, but he just laughed sincerely at this. He then continued, saying that he promised if she refused him tonight, he would do nothing. He knelt down. She told him to stand up, that she was fine. He took her hand and kissed it gently. Then he asked if he could take this as her consent and started kissing her hand again. Rising from his knees, he asked if he could let her hair down. She looked at him a little uncertainly. He then gently lowered her onto the bed and admired the way her hair swept around the girl in black waves. Veled added that he hadn't planned on getting married and didn't expect to be lucky enough to marry such a woman. For her, this was a somewhat awkward, and she asked if it didn't make him uncomfortable. But he didn't understand what she meant and asked again. She explained that it was because he had been called a demon. In response, he asked why she agreed to such an incredibly foolish plan to marry a demon in order to find a demon, because this puts her life at risk. Beryl said that while staying in the temple, she couldn't do anything, and he seemed better than the other 2 dukes, and better than the temple. But she didn't say this out loud. He, hovering over her, asked if he really was the best option of the three. She thought for a moment, then realized she just wanted to live, and this was her only last option. But then he smiled again and asked if perhaps she had been taught not to show such desires, even in married life. Then, kissing her forehead, he said that maybe it was like that in the temple, but in the Baine household, she could freely do whatever she wanted and desire whatever she wanted. But then he continued, saying that he was truly saddened that she didn't particularly distinguish him from the other two dukes. He asked her to close her eyes, but she began to panic. She felt this magic because it was sacred. But whose burning warmth it was, she didn't understand. It seemed that it wasn't the kind of magic she was used to. He continued, saying that everyone who desires a future has desires. After all, saying you don't desire something is the same as saying you don't think about the future. In other words, she should have desires too. Baine, as if peering into her soul, said that even priests have desires, but they refused to understand hers. It seemed the man was quite determined, but the girl didn't understand what was happening or what she was supposed to do. Then, kissing her foot, he said that she needed to try to act impulsively tonight, and he asked her to close her eyes, promising that he would do everything himself. Although he didn't know how to open a human heart, he knew how to open desires. He told her that she should learn to speak her desires, and he would help her. She asked why he was trying so hard for her, since he didn't love her, but she understood that such things could only be done for love, although there were those who didn't believe that, like the two other dukes. But they simply refused to be human. Though Velid wasn't human but a demon, he was gradually immersing himself in her soul, in her thoughts. He said that from the very first moment they met, she had a very pleasant scent that seemed to draw him in. It was hard for him to resist her, to not think about her, to not desire her. So now, he simply kissed her cheek and said that she should tell him what she wanted, and he would help her with that, and do whatever she wanted. Then he said that if she was afraid to succumb to desire, she should close her eyes. Taking her hands in his, he gently kissed her. At that moment, everyone was very curious about how soon the Duke would leave the bridal chamber, as they all knew he didn't enjoy spending the night with others. So the other demons started placing bets. Nibirius thought that the maximum would be 3 hours and he wouldn't be able to last. The other two demons, the assistant and the girl, bet on 5 hours. They were very confident that he couldn't last the whole day. They were the two highest ranking after the Duke, and they made the same choice. But the other demons were very curious why they chose exactly 5 hours. To which the assistant replied that His Grace knew about human traditions. But the others started laughing and saying, why follow them if they're demons? Who will even see them? So another demon bet only 1 hour. But no one expected what would happen next. An hour passed, then 2, even 3 hours went by, but Vine didn't come out. Everyone sat in silence, and it became extremely boring. The others wondered why they were so self-satisfied. Then the girl started explaining that the Duke personally gave his fiancée the wedding dress, and he usually wasn't interested in such things. But the other demons didn't know this, so one asked why she hadn't mentioned it, to which she said there was no need. Another demon, Helvis, was starting to realize that the Duke was probably interested in the saint. But still, these two assistants said that it couldn't be. Although it looked like he genuinely cared for her, in their eyes, it still seemed like she was just an accessory, not real care. They all kept waiting, and even 7 hours passed, but Duke Baine still didn't come out. At this point, they began to wonder if he might have killed her, which was not a far-fetched idea since he was quite prone to such things. Nibirius was about to run and check what was going on with His Grace, but the girl stopped him and said that there was no intention to kill her, because if she felt anything like that, she would have spoken up. And to be at it for 7 hours straight was incredible, even for His Grace. For Nibirius, it was quite humiliating to be a human's servant. But now they all started arguing about what to do, with some wanting to go check on the Duke, while others said it wasn't worth interfering, since they were servants and had to obey. But then Hedvas noticed that His Grace had finally come out. After this, Nibirius boldly opened the window and headed somewhere. He boldly opened the window and jumped down, landing masterfully in front of the Duke. He yelled that the Duke must have been exhausted, but the man glared at him and scolded him for speaking too loudly. He yelled that the Duke must have been exhausted, but the man glared at him and scolded him for speaking too loudly. Then the other demons came out, and Velid asked them, "Where are their veils?" The demon girl thought to herself that he hadn't married for love, so why continue keeping up all these traditions? But the demons obediently put on their veils. He then simply told them that they would need to move closer to noon, but for now, they should keep quiet, and he recalled all the details of that night. Valed told the girl that the night was long, so she could sleep peacefully after such a night, and everything would be fine. It seemed like he really cared for her. After reminiscing about that night, a smile even appeared on his face. But the demons couldn't even imagine that it wasn't just a battle. It was all truly about love. Later, the girl was shown the knights who would guard her and the personal servants she could use for her needs. Additionally, the assistant explained to the girl that even the chambermaids in this duchy had combat skills, so she could rely on them in case of any dangerous situation or anything else. Beryl thanked everyone and said she would be grateful for their help. Besides that, she noticed that the demon's attitude had drastically changed. Though Nibirius hadn't yet been favorably disposed towards her, the others said they would serve the girl with all their hearts. She had thoughts that this might be due to the earlier incident. After all, the demons, though not certain if it was truly a battle, decided to go into the room and check if everything was fine with the girl because they might need to bring her corpse in. Upon entering the room, they saw her lying in bed in nothing but a nightgown. She asked them if it was time to get up, why they had all entered. One of the demons replied that it was, and said she would bring her clothes. At that moment, the girl realized that she was nearly undressed in front of them, and she felt embarrassed. Moreover, there were no signs of any battle. The men coughed awkwardly and began to look away. Now, Beryl said that they needed to change some of the decorations in the living room. The demon girl explained that the Duke also understood that they were a little behind on fashion, so Beryl could freely change anything that seemed off. However, the girl didn't understand if they still wanted to maintain their image as humans, not demons, and avoid admitting their true nature. The other girl asked Beryl if she liked having so many servants around, to which she replied no. So the girls sent the other demons off to their respective places, and it was just her and Beryl walking together. But they both seemed somewhat distant. After all, the girl was also quite enigmatic and secretive. Her face was unreadable. Even though she was friendly, it was unclear what she was really thinking. Beryl thanked her for sending the others away. Then she asked if she could return to her room for a moment. Currently, the girl was wearing a luxurious black dress with mesh sleeves. She looked absolutely stunning, and the outfit suited the castle perfectly. However, Helvis had been observing the entire situation for a few minutes. Later, he went to the Duke when he was reviewing some papers. Then he brought another letter and told him that the saint had tried to send a letter to the temple and handed it to the Duke. The Duke thought for a moment, looked at the letter, and wondered what evidence she could have found. What made her decide to send something to the temple? He looked at it carefully, but then said that the letter should be sent as it was. However, Helvis didn't understand how this was possible and suggested that the Duke read the letter first. The letter mentioned that the girl had spent some time with Duke Baine and had not found any evidence that he was a demon. This didn't give the Duke any reason for suspicion, but it did surprise him, because she could have easily accused him of being a demon. However, he couldn't understand what she was thinking. Of the options in his mind, either she was a saint who didn't believe in God, or perhaps she really wanted to stay here to learn about passion. He then realized that if she didn't easily reveal her thoughts, he would have to help her with that. There once was a goose that laid golden eggs. Every day she would lay one golden egg for her master, and he was very happy, as it was like a treasure. But one day, he thought that maybe there were even more golden eggs inside her, and the master killed the goose. But after that, he never received any more golden eggs. That was his biggest mistake. Now Vine could no longer understand this man. Pride, envy, wrath, lust, sloth. There are other sins, 7 in total, but none of them attracted the protagonist. He had everything he wanted. He had it all. Especially he wasn't interested in lust. Until he met Beryl. Before, upon hearing the story about the goose that laid golden eggs and its foolish master, he laughed. He thought him stupid. But now, after meeting Beryl, it seemed to Vine that he understood the man. He wanted to have complete control over her. But if he did that, her body wouldn't withstand it. And so, he had to hold back, to endure. When he worked, the desire to go to her room would overwhelm him. He began to wonder if he was truly enchanted. The emotions he felt from Beryl were so strong and positive that he even began to want to live. It was as if she illuminated his path. And it seemed like something new to him, something incomprehensible. But maybe it was also because she had died twice already. Thanks to her energy, which she drew from, his magical power, which had been damaged in battle, was finally restored. So, the letter was sent to the temple, which should have been sent from the very beginning. But in truth, Vine didn't want to know whether Beryl had temporarily lost her way as a saint, or if she was simply a human who didn't believe in God and wanted to learn about desire. What really mattered to him was whether she really planned to leave this place, or if she could stay with him. This question wouldn't let him rest. And it felt like something new for him. From the very beginning, he had tried not to think about it, as such emotions were foreign to him. But he knew one thing for sure. He eagerly looking forward to the nights with her. The girls stood at the window and thought back to yesterday. When they were walking back to the castle with Decorabia, it felt very strange. Beryl had heard that something had happened. Perhaps even monsters had attacked. Moreover, when Niberius arrived, he greeted her very politely, which was very unusual. Before, he had only looked down on her. Even when he greeted her, there was always a sense of superiority. But she was very curious about what had happened. It probably wasn't something good. Then the Duke arrived, but strange screams were heard. She thought that perhaps these were monster screams, but he gently took her face in his hand and simply told her not to look. To which she replied that it was a matter of the mansion. She explained that, as the mistress of the house, she had to show care and think about others. So, he suggested that she go with him as the mistress of the house. But she asked where, to which he replied, to the funeral. But she was surprised and didn't understand for whom exactly. Could it be for the monsters? And then she began to think that there were some secrets she didn't know about, but they were quite important. After some time, the screams stopped. But the girl couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She then considered the possibility that maybe it wasn't the monster they had spoken about, but someone from the Baine family, one of the demons. That's why she began to question Baine. The girl said she'd keep him company. The Duke told Decorabia to help Beryl prepare, to which she nodded, and he told the girl that she would soon find out directly what the Baine family was. They all dressed in mourning attire, in black, in a rather classic style. Approaching the grave, she looked at the girl who lay there. She couldn't understand, as she didn't look like a monster, nor a demon from the Baine family, something in between. And then it dawned on her that this person seemed to have been frozen in the process of transforming into a monster. But she wondered, does this really happen? She had never heard of it before, and had never seen such things in the real world. Besides, she knew that monsters were usually just burned. She couldn't understand who this girl was and why they even made a grave for her and prepared her tombstone. She asked what this place was, if it was the Baine family cemetery. After a brief silence, Velid replied that yes, and that they buried the servants of the Baine family here. A few hours before her death, Duke called the servant and asked if she wanted to spend her final hours in the palace, or if she had other options. She replied that yes, she could preserve her honor, but she wanted to leave and fight monsters to help His Excellency and kill as many monsters as she could in her final hours. After all the servants he called to him already knew that if he called them, it meant they would soon die, as they became monsters due to a lack of magical energy. If a sudden source of energy wasn't found, that would be their fate. Finally, he told her that he would make a grave for her and that she would die a worthy death. And her name was Kilatia. And this happened very often, and this wouldn't be the last such death. Everyone would meet the same end as Kalasha. His own end was also approaching due to a lack of magical power. But his meeting with Beryl changed his fate. He realized that perhaps not only his future, but everyone's future here could change. Even the pure energy that came from her now was filling others. And most likely, he wasn't the only one feeling it. Others must also feel this pure, strong energy emanating from her. Therefore, they all had to understand that only she could change something. But he still couldn't understand why, even now, looking at this girl, even if she didn't know they were demons, there was already all the evidence. Why did she pretend she didn't sympathize if they were her enemies? Why didn't she report them to the temple? This really troubled him. He couldn't understand her thoughts. He didn't understand what the girl was thinking. But he hoped very much that she wouldn't do anything against them, and that he wouldn't be torn between his people and her, wondering what he needed to choose. Veled was sitting at the desk in his study, replaying the conversation he had with Beryl after the funeral had ended. The girl said that now that the burial ceremony was over, she would be on her way and wished the deceased to rest in peace. Hearing the man's gratitude, she beamed with a smile and said she hadn't done anything special. And even after he told her that all the Baine family's servants find their final rest in this place, Her only reaction was a brief, "Oh, I see." Why then, after such undeniable evidence, did the girl not rush to declare their family as demons? The man couldn't understand what she was thinking. Valette had always believed that she wouldn't care whether he lived or died, since he had always seen his own death in visions. But now, thanks to the saint, demons had a chance to survive without turning into monsters. For the first time in his life, he was faced with such madness. He even found it almost laughable to be stuck in such a state of uncertainty. But until Beryl becomes the source of their energy, all that hope is meaningless. Valette couldn't understand why he felt so anxious and kept thinking about her. The girl wouldn't leave his thoughts. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the out-of-breath Helvis, who quickly apologized and reported that a reply from the temple had arrived, and that, apparently, the saint was preparing to send them a response letter. He asked excitedly whether he should bring the letter to him as usual before sending it, but the man, after pausing for a moment in thought, replied that it wouldn't be necessary. He rose from the desk and said that this time he would simply go to the saint himself. At that moment, Dicarabia brought a letter from the temple for Beryl and asked if she was going to read it or just burn it. The girl smiled and replied that she'd rather read it. After opening the letter, the saint read the dry text, asking whether she had found any traces of demons within the Baine family. The girl thought that Dicarabia had been right. It would have been better to just burn the letter. Too little time had passed since the wedding, so she decided it would be better to reply to the letter and buy herself a bit more time, to observe her husband's family further. Just as she was writing her reply, the door behind her opened, and Duke Baine entered, asking what the young lady was busy with. To his surprise, the young lady met his gaze with complete calmness and replied that she was writing a letter. The man studied her face carefully. Leaning closer to her, he didn't break eye contact and asked if he could take a look at what she had written in the letter. The girl froze from how close he was, and mistaking her silence for consent, he took the letter from her hands. He began reading it aloud, but the saint had nothing to hide. She hadn't written anything compromising. She was writing a response to the high priest, stating that she had conducted a thorough investigation and had not yet found any traces of demons within the Baine family. Beryl looked at her husband, smiling. She had no intention of betraying his family. Valette was surprised, so he decided to tell her what she was so interested in. He knew that she was curious about the connection between them and the monsters. The saint was indeed curious, but she didn't want to show it. So, lowering her gaze, she simply replied that, in fact, she wasn't interested. The man froze, struggling to understand what was on her mind, what game she was playing with him. But then, suddenly, he said that since their first meeting, one question had been on his mind. Why did the girl pretend not to notice anything? His green eyes never stopped studying her face. He asked why she chose his family, knowing the entire truth. The girl was torn with doubts, wondering whether she should be honest with him or simply avoid the conversation, pretending not to understand what he was talking about. The Duke smirked and asked if she knew why he had been intrigued by her motives from the very first glance. He told her that his eyes were special, that he had seen her death in Orabas in her first life, and that in her second, she had been sacrificed wearing the robes of the Ubar family. The girl trembled with fear, unable to understand how he knew about her past lives. Veled pulled her gently into his arms. He looked at the girl with hope in his eyes and asked if, in her third life, she would be willing to move forward together with him and his family. The man knelt before her, holding her trembling hand, and asked if she was willing to stay by his side and open the gates of hell together. Since childhood, the saint had been taught that a deal with a demon always benefits the demon alone. No matter what he promises, in the end, he will take the most precious thing from a person and laugh at their naivete. That's why the girl was now overwhelmed with doubt. His offer sounds so sweet. But what is he lacking if he's making such an offer to someone like her? She looked at him with doubt, unsure why a demon would need a saint, and questioned whether she could truly agree to a deal with him. Suddenly, Veled said that he could feel her emotions, fear, sadness, and betrayal, and that those were the most enticing kind of nourishment for demons. That's why he couldn't stop thinking about her day and night. He was drawn to the intense feelings radiating from her. He stood up and gave the girl a predatory look. He admitted that at first, he thought it was only that which attracted him. But then he realized it wasn't just about her energy. The girl blushed, lowering her gaze, and said she had no idea what he was talking about. He gently ran his hand over her cheek, bringing her gaze back to him, and said that he understood his proposal might seem suspicious, but he would be completely honest with her. Leaning closer to her face, he explained that his eyes had a special power, and that, with the help of a mirror, he could see the end of his life every day. Just like Calathea, he loses his magical power and eventually loses his sanity. He had seen himself transform into a monster. Beryl now realized that demons turn into monsters because their magical power drains away. The Duke continued, saying that with her arrival, his fate had changed. From now on, he no longer saw his death. The man took a strand of her hair and said that now he saw a woman with deep green hair. His head rests on her lap as she, in a pure white dress, smiles warmly at him. The saint thought that such a hair color was quite rare. Velid gently kissed her wrist and said that he believed she was the one, the very girl, and that it was driving him crazy. She had appeared in his endlessly monotonous life and changed it. He believed that she was the one who could alter his fate. That's why if she exposes them and leaves, his only end will once again be death. That's why he can't let her leave him. He asked, "What about you?" Beryl listened to him attentively and realized that they were very alike. She didn't want to die. She wanted to live. It seemed to her that in this third life, with him, she could change her fate. In this, they were very alike. The man looked at her and said that she already knew the whole truth about them, but it didn't seem like she was planning to expose them. The girl simply nodded lightly and replied that he's right. In the next moment, he pulled her towards him and hugged her tightly, letting out a sigh of relief. Velid confessed that he had never been so obsessed with anything like he was with her, and that he couldn't think of anything else but her. Smirking, he added that she should take advantage of this revelation. The saint stared at him in confusion, and the man cupped her face in his hands, whispering that she should use him for her own purposes. He gently kissed her, feeling a sense of joy and relief. Beryl smiled, feeling as though a huge weight had lifted from her shoulders, and now she wouldn't have to pretend anymore. She asked what exactly he meant. The Duke smiled and said that she should simply stay by his side. From the desire to live to any other desires, he promised to fulfill them all. He pulled the girl close to him and whispered against her lips, asking whether she would choose a life with him in hell or a life in paradise with traitors. For the first time in her life, the saint decided to make a choice for herself. The lad stepped out with the girl in his arms and officially declared to the demons of the Baine family and those beyond the gates of hell that Saint Beryl was now officially declared the wife of the demon, Duke Baine. Saint Beryl will open the gates of hell during the opening ceremony. The demons were confused, not understanding what was happening. Someone asked what it all meant. Renove tensed and replied that it meant the saint was no longer just a human. Nibirius slammed his beer mug on the table and said loudly that this was all some kind of farce, and that perhaps the saint wasn't so saintly after all if she was planning to open the gates of hell. But another demon objected, saying that if it weren't true, Duke Baine would have warned them. One of them said that if the saint officially denies their connection to demons, their family will no longer be under suspicion, which would allow the name of the Vine family to spread to other lands. The negative emotions of humans, which demons needed to replenish their strength, had to be harvested by the Baine family demons in chaotic battlefields. Their resources were quite limited, but if the saint disproves them to be demons, they will be able to act more openly, which would be a tremendous help, especially now when their magical power is catastrophically low. The members of the Vine family were pleased that they no longer had to pretend in front of the saint. Everyone except Nibirius, who still didn't trust her. He considered her a puppet of the temple and believed the girl might have her own thoughts and motives. That's why he had no intention of sitting idly by. Beryl woke up, stretching sweetly with a soft sigh. Suddenly, she heard Dicarabia's voice. The demoness was sitting not far from the bed and informed her that the Duke had gone out on business. She then asked if the girl had slept well. Beryl recalled how passionate the previous night had been, along with their conversations. It all felt like a dream to her. Dicarabia peered at her closely and asked if the lady was feeling well, noting how her face had turned completely red. The saint replied that everything was fine and asked if the Duke's affairs were related to humans. The demoness replied that it was indeed so and said it was related to the upcoming grand exorcism ceremony. The saint remembered that in her past lives, the temple had done the same thing. They summoned 3 families suspected of demonism and conducted a grand exorcism ritual during which any demon was forced to reveal themselves. The girl was having lunch when Dicarabia suddenly announced that she was a star demon. Beryl was surprised, then recalled that the previous night, Velid had told her he was a demon of insight. The girl asked if their titles were connected to their demonic abilities. The demoness admitted that it was true. Her title was indeed tied to her demonic abilities. She confessed that it was difficult for her to move around during the day, but at night, the more stars there were in the sky, the stronger she became. Then Beryl anxiously asked if it had been very difficult for her during the wedding ceremony, as the sun had been shining so brightly. De Carabia replied that everything was fine, and that the umbrella helped ease her condition. Beryl said that she would remember that from now on. But the demoness replied that the mistress shouldn't remember such things or worry about anyone. From now on, no matter what she desires, everyone would bow before her and do everything she wished. Beryl knew that this was the way of the demon world, but she also understood that any command she gave would be carried out solely based on the authority of Velid. It might work for a while, but honestly, the demons wouldn't truly listen to her. Therefore, that option didn't suit her. She agreed to live with them and open the gates of hell, but she wanted to get to know them better and earn their trust. Such a revelation surprised the demoness. She hadn't expected that her mistress would want to earn the demon's recognition. Beryl smiled and said that she understood her status as a saint would raise suspicions among the demons, but she didn't want to rely solely on Duke Baine's authority. She could see that De Carabia was impressed and a little embarrassed. She asked the girl to tell her about the demons currently residing in the castle. According to the demoness, aside from the lesser demons in the human world, there were currently 8 demons. She suggested calling them to introduce them officially, but the saint said it would be better to go herself and observe them in their usual work environment. De Carabia suggested starting with Nibirius. He was a general and an inspector. Beryl already knew him and was aware that he viewed her with disdain. The demoness explained that his task was to deal with those who dare to even think ill of the Duke. The girls headed towards the building of the knightly order when they saw one of the demons hurrying towards Nibirius. They heard that the demon named Kashirin was running out of magical power and would soon transform into a monster. The saint froze in horror, as it had been very little time since the last funeral. Nibirius gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, thinking, could he really lose another comrade? Beryl stood, realizing that those gifted with magic were called demons, while in reality, they were cursed and cast out of the human world. She caught the general's gaze, full of hatred, directed at her. And then she realized that Nibirius didn't hate her. He hated all the priests she reminded him of. She knew that Kashirin was one of the youngest demons. But according to De Carabia, the transformation into monsters began with the oldest demons, those with the weakest abilities. Nibirius suddenly said that Kashirin had far less magical power than they had thought, and all of this was due to how difficult it had become to gather magical energy because of the temple's surveillance. He looked at the girl with disdain and asked why she had come to the Knight's building. But the girl paused, vaguely recalling something she might have heard or known about magical power. Then she remembered how one of the priests had raved about needing to hide a treasure, and that without it, they wouldn't have magic and wouldn't be able to communicate with them. And then it dawned on her. She asked if they had a source of magic, would they be able to prevent demons from turning into monsters? De Carabia, intrigued by what had come to the lady's mind, replied that it was indeed possible. Beryl smiled and replied that in that case, it seemed she knew the way out of the situation. The demons stared at her with surprise and curiosity. Once, in her second life, commoners approached Duke Ubar with complaints about strange happenings and the mysterious deaths of people. But Duke Ubar ignored their pleas to solve the problem. But then, one of his trusted knights, carrying out his orders, died under the same strange circumstances. Then the Duke decided to take action and accidentally discovered the very treasure on his land. However, this happened long after the waiting period was over. But this time, the waiting period began much earlier, and there is a chance that Ubar is unaware of the existence of the treasure at all. Since the waiting period involves all 3 noble families, the dukes leave their lands during this time. Therefore, during this period, they could travel to Duke Ubar's territory and find the treasure. But since Velid is also absent, she will have to take control of the Baine's forces. But will Nibirius agree to her persuasion? She had to try, so she confidently looked at the general and said that they urgently needed to discuss the issue of the expedition. The demons were shocked and asked if she really wanted to undertake something like this without the Duke's knowledge. The girl replied that this was indeed the case and that she did not intend to act against the Duke. A mocking voice of Nibirius was heard, sarcastically saying that he, in any case, had no intention of following her orders. De Carabia tried to tell him to stop behaving in such a manner, but Beryl stepped forward and said that, regardless, he was bound by the rules set in the demon world. The demon merely smirked and replied that, according to their rules, she was not in a position to give orders. Suddenly, a terrifying power emanated from the saint. Her eyes gleamed, and she replied that he well knew that in the world of demons, power meant a great deal. So when she said she had a proposal for him, Nibirius smirked and asked if she was offering him an arm wrestling match. But the girl just smiled and said that demons love making deals, and she proposed a bet with him. Nibirius smirked, thinking that the girl was too naive and didn't realize what she was getting herself into. He asked what she would wager in case of losing. Beryl responded that if she lost, she would convince Velid to not oppose the demons disobeying her. But if she won, Nibirius would unquestioningly follow any order she gave. She knew that the hierarchy of demons was determined not only by raw power. After Velid, the highest-ranking demon was Ronov. However, the knights are commanded by Nibirius, which means that in the hierarchy, strength is not the only thing that matters. Tikarabia said that the lady was right, and that sometimes exceptional strategy or significant achievements could help one attain a high rank. Beryl smiled and said that she knew it all along, and that, as the wife of Duke Baine, she planned to win this wager and strengthen her position among the demons. Nibirius was surprised by such a cunning tactic and remarked that she spoke with the confidence of someone who had already won. He then asked if she was ready to share the details with him. The saint noticed how intrigued the man was and asked if he was really that eager to make a bet. The general replied that of course he was interested, but suddenly, Beryl said she had doubts about him. After all, she would need his absolute obedience, but she wasn't sure Nibirius would keep his word. It was as if she were mocking him. Such an attitude offended the man. He shouted that, for demons, honoring the terms of a wager was a matter of honor. The girl said that in that case, she trusted him and was ready to make the wager. They discussed the terms and both agreed on the stakes. Nibirius smirked maliciously and said that if she lost, her life at the Vine estate would become truly miserable. But the girl radiated an air of confidence and replied that she would not lose. She smirked and said that she no longer intended to lose what little she had left. To herself, she thought that perhaps this too could be considered one of her wishes. She immediately imagined Velid and wondered what he would say to that, as he had promised to fulfill all her wishes. Finally, Beryl straightened up and gave her first command. She ordered Nibirius to go to Ubar's lands and retrieve the Demon Spirit Jewel. The general froze in place upon hearing her command. He had expected anything, but not this. The demons nearby also froze, whispering to each other in disbelief, wondering if they had really heard correctly. Did the mistress truly speak of the Demon Spirit Jewel? It was an ancient artifact that disappeared during the reign of the great Duke Kellic. Nibirius thought she must be mocking him. He said that no one had been able to find this artifact, even after searching desperately, and now she expects him to believe that she has found it? And in the temple, no less? The saint replied that it was true, and that the Demon Spirit Jewel emitted magical power with which they would be able to overcome the shortage of magic. The man doubted whether it was the real artifact, and then Beryl told him to hurry and find out, for Kashirin's sake. He felt uneasy that the only thing on his mind was winning the bet, while this woman was thinking about their comrade. Nibirius decided that he would carry out her order and find out if she would truly be the salvation for the demons, or just a waste of time. With confidence, he declared that he would immediately announce the expedition to the lands of Ubar. But the saint quickly stopped him and said that they did not need a direct confrontation with Ubar, and that she meant a covert infiltration instead. Nibirius gave the order to the soldiers to prepare for the covert infiltration. At the same time, Duke Orobos was loudly outraged upon receiving the news that his family had to prepare evidence proving they were not demons. He was furious, shouting that he had sacrificed a huge amount of gold, which was meant to silence the priests. The butler informed the Duke that he had learned that the chief priest at the temple had recently changed, and it was likely that the more thorough inspections were related to this change. Duke Orobos smirked, thinking that perhaps all of this was just a scheme to secure more donations. Then he became serious and said that it would be better if they were accused of demonism. After all, then the saint herself would come to their family for the investigation, and no one would claim they just paid off the gold. He suddenly remembered the saint during the wedding ceremony. She was a beautiful girl, graceful, with delicate skin. He froze in surprise upon seeing such beauty, and even felt a pang of envy toward Duke Baine. He sat with a smirk, contemplating what it would be like to defile a woman who appeared so pure and innocent. After all, she was a saint, and something about her purity stirred a twisted desire in him. a craving to touch something so untouched and sacred. But unfortunately, Duke Baine had most likely already taken her purity. The butler interrupted his thoughts and asked what response should be sent to the letter from the temple. The Duke ordered him to show the appropriate respect. The next day at Castle Oribos, the Duke slammed his fist on the table in outrage. A new letter had arrived from the temple stating that the Oribos family had failed to provide sufficient evidence that they were not demons. The Duke was furious, exclaiming that even thieves should have some sense of decency. The butler also reported that unrest had begun to spread among the local priests, and they were demanding an investigation into the monsters from Oribos who had allegedly infiltrated their lands. Duke Oribos furiously declared that, at this rate, they would be known as fools across the entire continent. He ordered the butler to follow him to the underground archives. He was more than ready to prove that they were not demons, and now he finally understood why his ancestors had believed in the gods. He was confident that if he personally drank holy water, it would serve as sufficient proof. Lately, it had become difficult to obtain real holy water, even in the temples. But within the family's secret records, there was a recipe for its creation. Suddenly, one of the maids appeared, nervously reporting that the temple had moved the schedule for the dedication to an earlier date. Duke Oribos grimaced in anger. In the Baine castle, General Nibirius gathered a small squad and set out on the journey for a secret infiltration into Ubar's lands. 2 ladies from the castle walked out to see him off, anxiously discussing whether everything would be all right. There were no guarantees that the demon spirit jewel would be real, and they wondered what the real saint was thinking. Would she really help demons? What was her plan? Suddenly, they heard someone calling their names, and they turned around in fear. It was the saint, Beryl, now the wife of Duke Baine. She asked them if they had come out to see off Nibirius and his squad. The girls were shocked that their mistress knew their names. Few people addressed them by name, as they were just low-ranking demons. Beryl smiled and said that of course she knew their names, as she now lived in this castle and had to know its inhabitants. Rain and Chloe were surprised and pleased that the saint turned out to be such a sincere person. Later, one of the demons sat in a local tavern, reflecting on how, at first, he had thought the saint was hiding something. However, a few days ago, he caught a glimpse of her and realized that she was sincere. Beryl rushed into the room, shouting frantically for Helvas to stop doing something foolish and asking what had happened to him. The man was standing on the windowsill of an open window, and it looked as if he was about to jump. Realizing how it must have appeared, he quickly tried to calm the girl down and explained that everything was fine. His ability was transformation into something new. The saint calmed down and asked, suggesting that, to use his ability, he probably needed good concentration. Then the girl took out a small bundle and said that she had something for him. Unfolding it, she held out him a handful of sparkling stones in her palms. Helvas's eyes lit up with joy, and he asked what he had done to deserve such generosity. Beryl smiled and replied that during the wedding she had noticed how intently he had been observing her veil, and since she no longer needed it, she decided to gift him the remaining ornaments. Helvas was so touched and grateful that he transformed into a raven and began fluttering around the young woman. The saint laughed, saying he was tickling her with his wings. At that moment, a demon was watching them and thought to himself what a considerate and kind mistress they now had. Rain supported him, saying that high-ranking demons usually didn't even remember their names, and when the lady addressed them by name, it felt truly heartwarming. Chloe agreed with her friend and said that the saint seemed like a genuinely kind person and that she really liked her. In Duke Ubar's castle, it was also reported that the schedule for the dedication was moved to an earlier date. Duke Ubar grinned predatorily and said that in that case, they would have to accelerate their plans. Beryl sat with Decorabia, studying documents, and asked in surprise if not all the inhabitants of Baine's territory were demons, and how many of them didn't even realize that all the residents of the castle were demons. Decorabia confirmed that this was indeed the case, adding that many people believed the Duke had purposely settled among the monsters to protect the humans. The saint acknowledged that it was a very clever move, as the very fact that he was good at hunting monsters should earn Duke Baine great respect from the people. Unlike other noble families that oppressed the common people, even the ordinary knights of the Baine family treated the common folk with respect. Therefore, for the common people, they became the embodiment of an ideal. Decorabia took a sip of tea and said that they try to avoid getting close to civilian homes, only doing so in cases of extreme danger. Then Beryl asked if people weren't concerned that the Duke wasn't taking care of his lands, but the demoness replied that at first there were complaints. However, after seeing how busy the Duke was, they realized there was nothing to worry about. DeCarabia explained that the trust of the local people was not easily shaken because these lands had long been rejected by everyone. Since the Duke himself had chosen them, it was a true salvation for the people. And then the saint realized that for the people who had been abandoned by everyone because of the monsters, Velid truly was their savior. The demoness suddenly said that foolish people still believed that the first Duke Baine was the one who protected them. Then Beryl became cautious and asked which first Duke was being referred to. She asked if there had been other dukes before him, but DeCarabia answered that from the very beginning, the only Duke of these lands had been Velid. Beryl froze in horror, unable to understand how this could be possible, as the Baine family was quite old. The demoness explained that the Baine family had been founded 400 years ago, and since then, the only one who had ruled these lands was Velid. Then the girl suddenly realized that her husband must be at least 400 years old. She was filled with horror and shock. Then she asked if this meant that demons were immortal. DeCarabia answered that this was indeed the case, and that although the Duke had drunk from the Fountain of Wishes later than the other demons, he was still the most powerful demon. When Beryl asked which source she was referring to, the demoness replied that it was the source at the gates of hell, and that drinking from it could turn someone into a demon. Hearing this, the girl froze. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. She asked if that meant Velid had been an ordinary human, just like her. DeCarabia leaned in and calmly answered that all demons had originally been humans. 3 representatives of noble families sat on a bench in the church, listening to the prayers. Duke Baine sat with a bored expression, realizing that the priest hadn't even bothered to properly learn the prayer and kept stumbling over the words. He noticed that most of the clergy were either dozing off or yawning, making the whole scene look utterly ridiculous. The man recalled with admiration the old priests who truly possessed divine power. Velid crossed his arms over his chest with a smirk and thought that if even one such priest were present, things would be far more interesting. At last, the high priest concluded and thanked all those present for their faith and service to the Lord. He pressed his palms together and said that thanks to the support of the dukes, he was able to preach with greater devotion. Duke Baine thought that, just as he had expected, the only thing they truly cared about was offerings. It angered him, and he believed that if they truly desired wealth, they might as well drink from the fountain of desires. Unable to contain himself, he rose from his seat and loudly declared that it was time for him to leave. After leaving the temple, he clenched his fists in anger, fuming over the fact that these bugs had dared to waste his time on such nonsense. He barely held himself back from interrupting all of them. The man thought about how he hadn't seen Beryl for several days because of them, and her image immediately appeared in his mind. He couldn't wait to see her and hold her in his arms, so he impatiently said that they should hurry and return home as soon as possible. Renov was in the library when he suddenly heard a sound he could not possibly mistake for anything else. It was the sound of Duke Baine's horse's hooves. The man was confidently urging his steed forward, drawing closer to the castle. The demon rushed out into the courtyard to greet his master. He hastily assured the Duke that everything was in order at the estate, but Velid was only interested in one thing: where Beryl was. Renov replied that the saint was on the 5th floor and that he had a report concerning her. Duke Baine pierced the demon with a terrifying glare and asked why he referred to her in such a manner. The man apologized and corrected himself, saying that Duchess Baine had moved Naberius. Velid froze, intrigued by what had transpired in his absence, and ordered the demon to explain everything in detail. Beryl sat alone in the room, sipping her tea as she gazed out the window with a hint of sadness in her eyes. Suddenly, the door swung open and Velid entered the room. The moment he saw her, his eyes lit up with a spark. The girl was surprised to see him. She had missed him dearly, and now, at the sight of him, her heart began to race wildly. She asked him why he had returned earlier than planned, as he confidently walked toward her, but he didn't let her finish, pulling her toward him with a swift motion and kissing her deeply. Pulling away from her, he said that he hadn't seen her in a long time, and being around the priests was too boring and exhausting. Beryl's cheeks were still burning, and her lips were swollen from the kiss. She hadn't expected him to rush toward her the moment he entered. The man smiled and said that as soon as he returned, he heard some interesting news about what she had been up to while he was away. The girl stood up to face him, and he mentioned that he had heard about Naberius's departure. The girl immediately thought that he must have found it suspicious. After all, the troops had set out right after his departure, and she couldn't blame him for such thoughts. To her surprise, Velid took her hands in his and asked if she had seen anything from her past life. He knew that she was always very cautious and wouldn't have moved the troops without a compelling reason. Therefore, he was certain that there was a reason behind such a noticeable action. Moreover, since she had sent them to the lands of Ubar, he was more than certain that it was somehow connected to her past life. Beryl stood there in astonishment, unsure of how to respond. She felt embarrassed, for in all her lives, this was the first time someone had looked at the situation from her perspective and tried to understand her rather than accuse her. It seemed that he should doubt her more than anyone, but instead, he was thinking about her first and foremost. Velid sat on the edge of the bed and asked if she had heard that demons like to make wagers from past lives. He pulled the girl onto his lap and, grinning predatorily, said there was no need to go far, since she could give the order just with his name. The girl blushed and replied that she could have, but since she intended to stay here, she wanted to be remembered not just as the Duke's wife. Hearing this, the man became quite amused, winding a lock of her hair around his finger and whispering, "So, this is what you want now." He did not take his penetrating gaze off her, as if he were seeing into the very depths of her soul, and said that now he knew what she desired. Beryl looked at him and felt her cheeks flush. She wanted to explain her actions to him once again, but the man immediately kissed her, interrupting her. The kiss was quick and light. Then he rested his forehead against hers and said that he wasn't angry with her at all, and there was no need for her to explain herself to him. Then, in a flash, he rolled her over onto her back and hovered over her. Smirking, he said that he loved that she had made a deal with the demon to stay here. Beryl stared at him with wide eyes as he slowly removed his travel cloak. Velid gently stroked her hair and, leaning down, said that she could stay here for as long as she wanted. Then he said that he had missed her so much and kissed her again, not stopping this time. The only thought spinning in her head was whether she could really stay by his side forever. Then she closed her eyes and surrendered to the feelings overwhelming her. After Duke Baine showed the girl how much he had missed her, he sat on the bed and poured himself a glass of water. Suddenly, Beryl turned to him and asked if it was true that he had once been an ordinary human. A hint of sadness flickered in the man's eyes, and he replied that it was true. The girl sat on the bed and replied that she had always thought demons were cursed by the gods. The man replied that it was the will of the gods. They did not want to see humans threatening their power, so they decided to destroy all the mages who challenged them. The girl remembered that historical books mentioned how magical power was inferior to divine power, and that over time, it naturally dwindled away. Had everything she knew been a lie? Suddenly the realization hit her, and she asked if Velid had once been a mage as well. The man smiled and answered that she was absolutely right. He told her that all demons were once magicians who sought to fulfill their desires through their own power. They did not rely on the mercy of the gods, but instead sought to achieve their desires on their own. This is why they angered the gods so much and were punished. Beryl listened attentively to her husband and realized how cruel and unjustly everyone had treated them, how much they had to live through and endure in exile. She took his hand in hers and looked at him with eyes full of sorrow. Suddenly, he tightly embraced her and gently laid her back into the bed. He softly told her that the gods made it so that they had no way of restoring their magical power. That's why when their magic completely runs out, they transform into uncontrollable monsters. The door blocked them here, and beyond the door is called hell. Since then, they have preached that hell is the place for those who go against the will of the gods, and to avoid it, one must submit to them. That's why he decided it would be better to go to hell. Listening to his story, Beryl became more and more convinced of how similar they were, as she too had decided that it would be better to go to hell than to let anyone take her life. They were lying in bed chatting when suddenly the girl asked if this meant he had been here since the founding of the empire. Velid smirked, took her hand, and asked if his age bothered her. The girl blushed and replied that it wasn't about that at all, but rather the fact that it meant he would live much longer than she would. The man was taken aback and froze, while she continued, saying that in his long life, she would remain nothing more than a fleeting episode. Not letting her finish, the man covered her mouth with a hungry kiss. He looked into her eyes and said that it was not true, and that in his life, there had never been a greater motivation than the one she gave him. But Beryl didn't let him finish and said that, unless they fall out, she wanted to spend her entire life with him until the very end. The man stared at the girl in surprise for a few moments, not expecting such sincerity from her. Then he smirked again, leaning over her and saying that she need not fear him leaving, but rather the fact that he never let go of what belonged to him. He declared that her desire not to be alone would be easily fulfilled, and she would never be able to escape from him. The girl couldn't contain her joy and looked at him with sparkling eyes and a smile that spoke for itself. Beryl smirked and asked if she was truly so pleased by the thought that she would never be able to get rid of a demon. Meanwhile, Renove leaned over a table full of papers, contemplating how much work had piled up for the Duke. And yet, he was once again delayed. The demon had never seen his lord like this before, and he felt that it was no coincidence. He knew that what he was about to do might be considered rude, but he could not remain idle. He quickly reached the doors of his room, flung them open, and called out loudly for the Duke. Then he froze, feeling like a complete idiot at the awkward situation he had gotten himself into. Duke Baine was lying in bed with his wife, clearly after a passionate encounter, and was sweetly cooing. At the sudden appearance of the uninvited guest, Velad's eyes sparkled with anger. The man rose, and Ranavi felt an intimidating aura emanating from his master, unsure of where to go or what to do next. At that moment, Beryl woke up, rubbing her eyes, and smiled warmly, asking if her husband had slept well. The man's face immediately softened, and he gently said that she must be tired, and that it would be better for her to sleep a little longer. Meanwhile, Renove stood, embarrassed and in shock, unable to recognize the Duke he had always known. He had never seen the man like this before, and it made him uncomfortable to witness such an intimate display of affection. Beryl, nestled in Velad's embrace, asked if he wasn't in a hurry with his work, but he, gazing at her with tenderness, replied that everything could wait. Soon, Dekurabia arrived and helped the young woman into a beautiful dress, carefully styling her long hair. At the sight of his enchanting wife, Duke Baine couldn't hide his admiring gaze and said that she looked absolutely stunning. Renove and Dekurabia stood aside, astonished at how much their master had changed. Beryl told her husband that she was going to take care of some household chores, but the man followed after her and informed her that it was unlikely she'd be able to do so. The surprised girl asked why. That's when he told her that she had to come with him. Not knowing what else to say, Velad smiled and said that in Baine there was a tradition that newlyweds must go everywhere together after the wedding. The demons could barely contain themselves, wondering since when such a tradition existed among them, and why the Duke was acting so strangely. Later, Beryl sat on the sofa in her husband's study and asked if it was true that the gates of hell were located in the dungeon, not the opening ritual altar. The demon confirmed it, and Beryl fell into thought, realizing that the temple and everyone else were expecting the opening ritual, and only the saint was capable of performing it. In her second life, she, as the saint, became the sacrifice for the opening ritual. Depending on the nature of the sacrifice, either the gates to heaven or the gates to hell were meant to open. The opening ritual altar is more like an outpost. And then the girl suddenly realized something and asked if there were 2 gates to hell. Velad confirmed her guess and said that if one gate were opened, both gates would react and open simultaneously. The girl said that it was quite interesting. Then she asked if her husband had finished with work for the day. She remembered how Renove had begged him to get to work, as there was too much to do. But Velad had been sitting and watching her for quite a while instead. Velad was thinking about how amusing it was to hear her nagging. If it had been any other demon in her place, he would have already dealt with him. For some reason, her scolding only lifted his spirits and amused him. Meanwhile, the girl approached him and asked if he was even listening to her. Suddenly, he stood up and asked if she would like to see the gates for herself, since she seemed so interested. They descended into the dungeon, and the girl remarked that she had heard from Dekurabia that behind the gates lay the source of desires. The lad replied that it was true, and that if someone drank from it, they would transform into a demon. They stood in front of the gates, and the man, with a hint of sadness, said that, unfortunately, it was impossible to enter at the moment because the gates were nearly closed. Looking at the gates, the girl finally understood what it meant for them to close. Now, only a small crack remained, through which one could attempt to peek, but even then, all that would be seen was complete darkness. Suddenly, the man tensed and said that if the gates closed completely, the magic would fade away completely as well. But if the gates were opened, there would be no issues with the lack of magic, and then the demons would stop turning into monsters and dying. Beryl looked at her husband, feeling his despair. She now understood and shared his desire to open the gates. Suddenly, she resolutely headed straight for the gates. She felt that she had to help the demons. Duke Baine watched his wife with surprise and caution, not understanding what she was planning. Suddenly, the girl extended her hand and felt a magical connection with the gates. It was as if a wave of magic passed through her. The man froze in shock, unable to believe his eyes. For the first time, he witnessed the gates reacting to someone. Beryl stood frozen in front of the gates, unable to believe her eyes. They had just slightly opened. From within the infernal gates, she felt a powerful surge of magical energy. Even Velid felt the concentrated magic, as if it was breathing life into every cell of his body. He continued to stand there, unable to believe his eyes. The gates, which had previously been closing rapidly, were now, if only slightly, undeniably ajar. Beryl, standing in the glowing stream of magic, turned around and shouted to her husband that it wasn't her imagination. The gates truly had begun to open. She turned to face the gates and extended her hands, channeling power from her palms. She could feel the gates slowly beginning to shift, responding to her energy. Suddenly, she felt strong arms wrap around her from behind. Velid was holding her tightly, his voice filled with desperation as he pleaded with her to stop, fearing she might get hurt. They were both breathing heavily, visibly shaken by what had just happened. The girl said desperately that the gates had definitely begun to open and, with pleading eyes, asked why he had stopped her. The man pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close, and quietly answered that no matter how much he longed to open the gates again, her safety meant more to him than anything else. She turned to him and asked, "Isn't it surprising that the gates responded to me? Maybe I could open them without the opening ceremony." Duke Baine looked at her gently and replied that, undoubtedly, if they opened the gates even just a little more, no one else would have to die. The girl placed her palm on her husband's chest and suddenly asked if he had been afraid when the gods cursed him. He was surprised that she brought up the topic. It brought back memories of such a distant past, memories he hadn't thought about in a long time. He looked at his beautiful wife and thought about how she had the courage to open the gates with her fragile body. Just the realization that she was willing to save the demons made him admire her even more. He took her hand and, smiling, replied that he had nothing to fear. For if one lives relying only on the will of the gods, when they leave mankind, people will be helpless. Neither he nor any of the mages wanted that, so they made the choice to rely only on their own strength. And none of them ever regretted their choice. Beryl smiled and replied that such determination is very human of him. The man smirked and said that it was the first time he had ever heard someone call him human since he became a demon. The girl smiled brightly at him and said that before he had asked if she felt distance between them, but it was actually the complete opposite. She took his hands in hers and said that he was very much like her, and that he felt warmer to her than anyone else, and that he cared for her in a way no one ever had before. Later, the girl was in her room when Dicarabia handed her a letter from their temple. Upon opening it, she was horrified when she realized who the sender was. It was Father Claude who wrote that he would soon arrive for an inspection at the Baine estate. While the demons were relaxed, it was the perfect time to expose them. Beryl felt the blood freeze in her veins. She quickly told the demoness that an inspection would soon arrive at the estate, searching for demons. She ordered her to listen carefully, as the priest who would be leading the inspection was a very dangerous man. Among all the priests, he was fanatically devout. Moreover, he was highly sensitive to magical power and obsessed with the idea of entering heaven. In her second life, when she had finally managed to escape from the Ubar estate, it was he who had ordered her to be locked in solitary confinement. And then he suggested sacrificing the saint who had failed to detect the demons, hoping to appease the gods so they would lead the faithful into heaven. She wondered if she would have survived back then if it hadn't been for Claude. But now was no time to dwell on it. Urgent repairs to the estate and training of the demons were now a top priority. The girl told Dicarabia that she needed to see and speak with Velid immediately. Soon Beryl stood before her husband, telling him about the upcoming inspection. She said that Claude was very dangerous and was probably thinking that he would find 1 or 2 demons in the estate. The girl was worried that with his abilities, Claude would immediately realize that everyone in the estate were demons. Duke Baine approached his wife and said that they would figure everything out. He then suggested they eat and discuss everything before the food got cold. But the girl was determined and replied that she wanted to discuss everything right now. The man looked at her, wondering if he would ever stop being amazed by her determination. And then he agreed. Beryl sincerely wanted to do everything possible to save them, so she asked if she could take charge of the preparations for the inspection. The man approached her, extended his hand, gently stroked her hair, and leaning in, replied that she didn't need to ask for his permission, as she was the mistress of this estate and could do whatever she deemed necessary. While the girl remained silent in astonishment and embarrassment, he suggested that they have dinner after all. Beryl pulled a chair closer to her and said that recently she had been eating too little and that she needed to eat properly as there was a lot of work ahead. He sat down across from her and, seeing that she wasn't touching her utensils, anxiously asked if she wasn't hungry. The girl didn't know how to tell him that the sight of meat made her feel nauseous, as she didn't want to seem fussy. She asked if they had any other food. She wanted something simpler to eat, especially since the priests arriving for the inspection were also not accustomed to such exquisite food. The man admitted that he had long forgotten about ordinary human food. He kindly asked if she had any preferences. The girl immediately began to recall how she used to eat in the temple. It was usually very watery and tasteless porridge, or just bread with water. At the Orobos estate, unable to endure her hunger, the girl secretly snuck out of her room in search of food and met a very kind and good-natured cook. The man was so kind to her that he secretly fed her until someone found out and he was expelled from the estate. His food had been so delicious. Beryl, however, misheard and thought the girl had said the cook himself was delicious. Beryl hurried to correct him, saying that she meant his dishes were delicious and that she really missed something like that. The lad stepped closer to his wife and said that he had heard her. Then, with a sly smile, he added that if she had no appetite for food, there was something else. His eyes sparkled mischievously, and he said that he had no other choice but for her to go to bed a little earlier tonight. The girl's cheeks flushed when she realized what he was hinting at, and shyly asked, "Right now?" He picked up his wife in his arms and walked with a light stride, grinning as he asked what she meant, since he had been holding back all this time from the very beginning. Soon after, the girl, exhausted, fell into a deep sleep. Veled sat up in bed, deep in thought about her words. Today she was especially anxious. It seemed that this priest could really become a problem. She was so determined, but in the end, he couldn't control his emotions and took her to the bedroom. The man covered his face with his hand and thought that he had acted simply disgracefully. The next day, Veled sat at his desk, unable to shake off the excess thoughts, while Renov pierced him with a reproachful glance. Finally, the Duke informed him that the inspection would arrive soon. The demon asked what security measures should be taken. To his surprise, the man replied that the Duchess Baine would handle everything, and that they had lived as demons for so long that many things might seem strange to the priests. Beryl said that Beryl would personally oversee the repairs in the mansion and the training of the demons to ensure everything looked proper. As for Renove, he had the task of gathering information about the priest named Claudia. The demon asked interestedly what he had done. The Duke replied that this priest is capable of recognizing demons and will be part of the inspection. Finally, he asked his assistant to find a human cook. Meanwhile, Beryl was making her rounds with Dicarabia through the estate and realized that an enormous amount of repair work would be required. She told Dicarabia that there were too many unnecessary decorations in the corridors and they would have to get rid of them. The demoness replied that it was no problem at all and effortlessly lifted the large cabinet to carry it away. Beryl watched in horror as the girl carried the cabinet with just one hand, and she thought to herself that at this rate they would definitely manage to get the mansion in order in time. The demoness looked out the window and said that since the night was very starry, her power had increased, so tasks like this would be no trouble for her. Then, the girl remembered that Dicarabia was a star demon, so her power grew stronger the more stars there were in the sky. Beryl said that in that case, they would try to clear out all the unnecessary things from the hallways of the mansion tonight. The next day, the women went to the garden. The Duchess remembered that the gardener's name was Stolas. Stolas is a master of divination. His unique talent lies in reading omens through colors. Seeing the tall blonde man, they greeted him, and the demon bowed respectfully in return. He said that he was already aware that they were restoring the estate and asked if they wanted to refresh the garden. Beryl felt a bit awkward assigning him extra work, but she said they needed to tidy up. The man smiled and led them through the garden, showing them the common plants as well as those that could be dangerous to people. Stolas was enthusiastically talking about the garden when he suddenly noticed the scrutinizing gaze of his mistress. He asked if she wanted to say something. Meanwhile, Beryl was wondering if he really could predict the future and whether she should ask him a question. She gathered her courage and asked if he could predict her future. For a few moments, the demon carefully looked at her and then replied that, to be precise, he was more inclined to answer questions with a yes or no. Then he extended a flower in the palm of his hand and asked if she wanted to give it a try. Full of determination, Beryl felt that this was her chance and answered that she truly wanted to try it. She then asked her question. Would she be able to live more than 10 years? Upon hearing such an unusual question, Dikarabia and Stolas tensed up and were both surprised. The man accepted her question and, holding the flower, began to make his prediction. As he plucked each petal, the man whispered, "You will live. You will not live." Beryl's heart raced wildly as she waited for the outcome of divination result, wondering if she would have to accept a bitter end in this life, or if she still had a chance. Finally, there were no petals left on the stem, and its glow faded. Stolas smiled widely and answered that she would definitely live for more than 10 years. The girl froze in disbelief, staring at the stem. She still clearly remembered all her past lives and deaths, and now, thanks to those small, delicate petals, she could finally feel a sense of relief. Dikarabia stared at her mistress with concern and asked anxiously if she was all right. Stolas also looked at the Duchess in confusion, clearly alarmed by the sight of her holding back tears, which began to send him into a quiet panic. Beryl, barely holding back tears of joy, pressed her hands to her chest and replied with a radiant smile that everything was absolutely wonderful. She was overwhelmed with happiness, finally feeling that she could truly hope for a happy life. Beryl walked through the castle and saw that most of the interior renovation work was already completed. The grand halls no longer resembled a den of demons, but looked like a worthy residence of a high-ranking aristocrat. She carefully examined every corner, making sure that nothing suspicious remained in the estate. The girl felt satisfied, as it seemed to her that the castle was now fully prepared for the inspection visit, with no flaws left that could expose them. Dikarabia confirmed that almost all of the mistress's instructions had been carried out. She assured Beryl that the remaining small details would be settled before Father Claude's foot even stepped onto these lands. The girls felt a fleeting sense of relief, hoping that now they only had to pray for the absence of unforeseen incidents. However, Dikarabia's face suddenly turned serious, and she added that a certain circumstance had arisen. It turned out that a ghost had appeared in the mansion. This news shocked Beryl, as spectral entities were much harder to hide from the eyes of experienced priests than ordinary demons. Dikarabia explained that strange activity had been noticed on the lower floors, in the immediate vicinity of the Hellgate. Servants had begun reporting something inexplicable wandering in the shadows of the dungeons. Beryl tried to clarify if it was just another monster that had broken out from behind the gate, but the reports were unequivocal. This creature had nothing in common with the monsters they were used to. The main strangeness lay in the spirit's behavior. Witnesses claimed that as soon as someone tried to approach or touch it, the vision would instantly dissolve into thin air. The appearance of an elusive ghost right before Claude's inspection jeopardized the entire legend of the estate. Beryl realized that they needed to deal with this guest immediately before the fanatical church servants discovered it. Beryl asked if any demons had such an ability, but Dikarabia knew of none. The saint reasoned that, since demons existed, ghosts were also quite possible. She decided they should investigate it personally. The girls headed to the dungeons to verify the rumors of the strange phenomenon. Meanwhile, in the library, Velid learned from Stolas about Beryl's fortune-telling. The Duke slammed his book shut in anger, demanding immediate details. Stolas confirmed that Beryl was interested in only one thing: whether she would live longer than 10 years. Learning that the answer was positive, Velid grew somber. It bothered him that his wife doubted a long life by his side. Stolas admitted he suspected an illness, but Beryl denied it. Velid seriously wondered what kind of future she hoped to see in 10 years. To find answers, the Duke ordered Stolas to read his own fortune as well. Stolas warned that he only had one flower left for the reading, and growing another one would take a significant amount of time. But that didn't stop Velid. He asked his most important question: would Beryl be able to change their shared future? With full seriousness, Stolas confirmed that he was ready to begin the ritual immediately. The golden petals began to fall one by one, carrying two possibilities. Either the saint would change their fate, or she would not. Watching this, Velid felt a sting of doubt. He blamed himself for his haste and for not considering the question more carefully. However, the news that Beryl would live a long life had robbed him of his peace, and he desperately needed an answer to calm his restlessness. The divination confirmed his hunch. The Duchess would indeed be the key to changing their destinies. At that moment, Velid turned sharply to the demon, seized by a sudden hope. Did this mean that in this new future, they would stay together? But Stolas only threw up his hands in confusion. The flower was finished, and he had no more answers to give. The Duke curtly ordered his assistant to leave, trying to hide his disappointment behind a mask of coldness. Left alone in the empty room, he sank into his thoughts, trying to realize what path lay ahead of them now. Velid couldn't get Beryl's question about whether she would live for the next 10 years out of his head. Fragments of visions flickered in his memory, showing that this girl had died 3 times before. One of those dark outcomes ended in asphyxiation, leaving a bloody mark in his consciousness. Another time, he saw her lifeless body on an altar, offered as a sacrifice for someone else's interests. The Duke was angry with himself, for his magical power was not enough to see the details of all her past tragedies. Now Stolas's prediction made sense. Beryl had somehow miraculously managed to avoid all her predestined deaths. It was her will and decisions that became the sword that cut the old threads of fate and changed their shared future. However, time was relentless, and the image of an hourglass reminded him of the 10-year limit. The man was tormented by doubt as to whether Beryl would want to stay by his side when the threat of death finally vanished. At the mere thought that she might leave him, a sharp physical pain flared up in Velid's chest. A deathly chill washed over him, and he realized he could no longer live in ignorance. To see the truth, the Duke resolutely approached the huge prophetic mirror, intending to learn the finale of their story. Velid stood frozen before the mirror, unable to forget Beryl's question about her 10 years of life. The prophetic petals trembled, once again revealing the image of a woman with deep green hair. In this new future, she leaned over him in a snow-white robe, granting peace and light. He stared intently at her features, trying to realize if fate had truly given them a chance. Beryl smiled at him warmly and sincerely, illuminating his dark existence with her purity. But suddenly the vision changed. The girl turned around and began to slowly walk away into the darkness. Velid desperately reached out his hand after the vanishing image, trying to hold her back at any cost. A cry full of pain escaped his chest. He begged her not to leave him alone. At that same second, a sharp pain pierced his body, and thick blood spurted from his mouth. His magical energy was completely depleted, causing a devastating blow to his system. The Duke realized that with such a mana deficit, transforming into a mindless monster was inevitable. He collapsed to his knees before the mirror, once again seeing the very same horrific end he had always imagined. Velid realized he could no longer simply accept his death. Before, the end seemed inevitable and natural, but now, having met Beryl, he flatly refused to give up and fade into nothingness. Strength was leaving his body, and as he lost consciousness from magical exhaustion, he whispered only one name in his delirium: the name of his wife, who had become his only anchor in this world. At this time, Beryl, unsuspecting, was enjoying the results of the renovation. She was considering which curtains would best suit the interior until a sudden premonition told her that something terrible had happened in the castle. Going down into the hall, she froze in unbearable horror. Velid was literally covered in blood and could barely stay on his feet. The girl could not believe that her powerful husband was in such a state. A desperate cry escaped the saint's chest. She rushed to Belith, covering her face with her hands in shock, not knowing how to help the man, who until recently seemed invulnerable. Rushing to him, Beryl tried to catch her husband's falling body. She screamed in helplessness, begging Belith not to close his eyes, and being horrified by the amount of blood on his clothes. Falling to the floor with him, the girl began to frantically call Decarabia for help. She held Velid close, feeling his life slowly fading in her arms. Decarabia, arriving just in time, kept her composure and told Beryl to calm down. The demoness understood the gravity of the situation and ordered his lordship to be immediately moved to his chambers for assistance. In the room, Beryl's trembling hands wrung out blood-soaked rags. The water in the basin instantly turned crimson, and the silence of the chambers was broken only by the wounded Duke's heavy wheezing. The saint was in despair, realizing there was no physician in the castle capable of healing a demon. She begged Decarabia to stay with him, believing that a fellow demon would be better at watching over him. But the assistant looked at Beryl with deep sympathy and confidence. She knew something the saint did not yet understand. Their bond was much stronger than any wounds. Decarabia assured the lady that the Duke would recover much faster in Beryl's presence. She explained that the wife's presence was the best medicine for Velid at such a critical moment. She stated plainly that Velid would have been in mortal danger if Beryl had not been there. These words made the girl realize her immense responsibility for her husband's life. Beryl remained sitting by the bed, trembling from the stress she had endured. She looked at Veled's pale face, vowing to herself that she would do everything possible to make him open his eyes again. Beryl blamed herself for her helplessness, feeling useless at such a critical moment. Suddenly, Veled regained consciousness and asked what exactly she hated so much. The girl gasped in surprise, seeing that her husband had finally opened his eyes. She anxiously began to ask about his well-being, trying to understand what had happened. The Duke sat up in bed and ignored his wounds, repeating his question about her hatred once more. Beryl was completely confused, not understanding what Veled was getting at. The man gave her a sly look and asked if she perhaps hated him. The saint fearfully denied it, assuring him of her loyalty and sincere feelings. Veled silently pulled her close and hugged her tightly, as if afraid to let go. He stopped right by her face and insisted on an answer, wanting to know the true cause of her emotional pain. Beryl could not contain her curiosity and directly asked Beleth what had actually happened to him. Veled noted with a light smirk that she was quite bad at changing the subject, and then admitted that the cause of his condition was complete magical exhaustion. Hearing about magic, the saint was bewildered. She pushed her husband back slightly to look into his eyes and anxiously asked if the danger had passed now. The man gently said her name and assured her that he felt much better now. He confessed that the moment he felt a critical drop in energy, his instincts drove him to go looking specifically for his wife. The Duke realized on an instinctive level that Beryl was the only person he needed in order to stay alive. The girl was astonished that her mere presence could be so healing. But Veled added that his feelings for her were much deeper and impossible to put into simple words. He shared that throughout his long life, he had always humbly accepted the inevitability of his end. However, this time, something inside him broke, and his old beliefs crumbled to dust. Veled admitted that now he desperately wanted to live for as long as he could. He was haunted by the unbearable fear that if he lost control of himself, he would never be able to see her face again. The very thought of eternal separation frightened the powerful demon to his core, and Beryl, seeing his vulnerability, was at a loss for words. Veled received word about what had happened earlier, specifically regarding his wife's strange fortune reading in the garden. That's why he directly asked Beryl if she was hiding some kind of illness. The girl immediately realized that his concern was sparked by her asking Stolas whether she would live longer than 10 years. She hurried to assure her husband that she was perfectly healthy, claiming her interest was driven only by simple curiosity about her own future. Beryl admitted that it was indeed important for her to know if she would still be alive after such a long period. Recalling the visions of her past deaths, the Duke promised not to pressure her, waiting for the moment she would be ready to tell the truth herself. The saint continued to insist on her excellent well-being, but Veled expressed clear doubt regarding her words. The man stated that he was far too suspicious to take her word for it, and resolutely pulled his wife toward him. He pushed her back onto the bed, intending to verify the truth of her assurances for himself. His gaze turned predatory, and his intentions became completely unambiguous. The Duke wanted to see for himself if she was as full of life as she claimed. A blushing Beryl reminded Beleth of his recent blood loss and tried to convince him to simply get some rest. However, the Duke noted that the girl wasn't offering any resistance at all, which left the saint completely flustered. Beryl admitted that lately they had both been far too busy with their responsibilities, and she agreed that they shouldn't waste a single minute now that they were finally alone together. The man gently took her hand in his and quietly said that he was glad he had been given the chance to see what his precious wife truly desired. Beryl looked at her husband with embarrassment, but still gave her silent consent, holding his hand tightly and pulling him closer to her. Veled confidently promised his wife that this evening he would fulfill all of her wishes completely. After a passionate night, Beryl fell into a deep sleep. But in the morning, she was awakened by a persistent knock. Decarabia entered the chambers and asked whether her lady would like help getting dressed or if she wished to rest a little longer. The saint grew saddened when she realized she had woken up alone and asked where Veled had gone. Decarabia reported that the Duke, along with Renove, had urgently left for the human world on pressing business. She also reported an emergency. On the lower floors of the castle, the servants had spotted something frightening: a real ghost. Upon hearing about the mysterious vision, the saint instantly cast off her sleepiness. Intrigued and alarmed by the appearance of a spirit in the mansion, she ordered an immediate trip downstairs to personally deal with the uninvited guest. Far from the castle, in the desolate lands of Ubar, a desperate cry pierced the silence, calling for General Nibirius. A panting subordinate rushed to the general, who stood in the shadow of the trees. He hurried to report a discovery that had caused an unprecedented stir among the soldiers. It turned out that the squad had found the legendary Devil's Chalice, an artifact of incredible power that demons had been seeking for centuries. The relic was found by the scout company deep within the parched earth, where it had been hidden from the eyes of the living. The soldiers discussed that only thanks to the severest drought in decades had the landscape changed enough to expose the cache. Had the heat not stripped back the land to its very foundation, this treasure would have remained buried forever under layers of sand. No human, and not even a single demon, could have found this place on their own if it weren't for a precise tip-off. Nibirius stood in a daze, realizing an incredible fact. The coordinates of this place were given to him by the Saint Beryl herself. The fact that the Devil's Chalice was actually here seemed frightening and inexplicable to the general. Until that moment, he was firmly convinced that Beryl had simply sent them to this arid place to mock them and waste precious time. Seeing the relic with his own eyes, Nibirius felt a cold sweat. What had happened defied logic, and he realized he had no idea what this woman was truly capable of. Nibirius and his squad stood in disbelief as they brought the glowing Devil's Chalice to light. A cold sweat broke out on the general's brow. He couldn't comprehend how a mere human managed to know the exact location of an artifact that demons had sought in vain for centuries. His mind refused to accept the obvious, as Beryl had even known about the coming drought. Only because of the anomalous heat that parched the earth to deep cracks did the relic reveal its trail, and the saint had foreseen this with frightening precision. Nibirius froze as the realization of the lost bet hit him harder than any blade. He understood that his pride was now trampled, and he had officially become a servant to the orders of the lowly human, as he had called the saint until that moment. Beryl offered Nibirius a bet, cleverly exploiting his race's weakness for gambling. The general smirked arrogantly, asking what his reward would be if he won. The girl looked at him defiantly and stated her only condition. She demanded total obedience. If he lost, the demon would be obliged to follow her every command. In the present, Nibirius collapsed to his knees, realizing his utter defeat. The soldiers rushed to their commander in a panic, seeing his despair. He was consumed by the thought of unbearable shame. A great demon had now become a servant to the will of an ordinary mortal. Meanwhile, at the castle, the saint encountered a mysterious guest and directly demanded she identify herself. The silver-haired demoness looked down at the girl, admitting she had never encountered such strange creatures before. The inspection of the Baine Castle dungeons began under the dim light of torches. Beryl understood that the lower levels of the mansion were the most dangerous areas that could reveal the true nature of its inhabitants before the inspection. Descending the gloomy stone staircase, the saint felt the cold breath of the cellar. She flinched at every rustle, realizing that in this house, even the shadows could be alive. Beryl stumbled upon a gruesome taxidermy head of a monster mounted on the wall. She concluded that the basement was too cluttered with demonic trophies and decided to conduct a complete clearing for the estate's safety. The girl politely asked Decorabia to remove the frightening artifact from the wall. The assistant, without a word, demonstrated her demonic strength by easily tearing the heavy mount from the stonework. Leaving the maid to deal with the objects, Beryl decided to go even deeper. She was determined to personally check every dark corner before Inquisitor Claudia arrived. Examining the lower halls, the saint realized there was much more work than she had anticipated. The dungeon literally breathed with magic and the Baine family's past, which had to be hidden. In the silence of the empty rooms, Beryl continued to search for the ghost the servants had been whispering about. The thought of looking for a specter in a castle swarming with demons seemed both ironic and absurd to her. Suddenly, at the end of a long corridor, the saint noticed movement. She froze, staring into the void, until a distinct female silhouette emerged from the shadows. Beryl directly asked the woman who she was and what she was doing in the restricted part of the mansion. The stranger showed no fear. On the contrary, she measured the saint with an inquiring gaze. The woman stated that in all her long life, she had never encountered a demon quite like Beryl, clearly mistaking her for one of them. Beryl introduced herself as Beryl von Vine and asked for the stranger's name. The woman was surprised, claiming she had never heard of anyone by that name in the Vine family. Then the saint clarified that she was the official wife of Belith von Vine. Hearing the name Belith of the Mind's Eye, the stranger froze, feeling a deathly chill. Beryl confirmed her status as his wife, becoming visibly nervous under the guest's heavy stare. The woman was completely shocked by the news that boy had actually gotten married. Intrigued, the saint asked how she knew the Duke so well. A silence fell as the stranger revealed that Belith was her own brother. She closed in on Beryl, eager to find out what exactly made her brother want to marry this girl. The mysterious stranger suddenly realized that she was looking at a mere human, not a demon. This discovery made her fall silent for a moment, peering intently at the saint. The woman found the situation extremely amusing, stating it was the most intriguing thing she had heard in a long while. Beryl, however, knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down around this individual for even a second. Once settled in the drawing room, the demoness directly asked Beryl how she had known that the Vine family was demonic before even entering their household. The saint decided to be blunt and spoke about the inexplicable phenomenon. Something strange had happened to her twice, and she had managed to go back in time twice already. Her companion touched an old book, noting that Beryl's yearning for life had been so strong and fierce that it had literally rewritten the rules of reality. She explained that it was this powerful desire that had triggered the magical occurrence, allowing the girl to cheat death and turn back the clock. When asked if she had been happy in her previous lives, the saint truthfully answered no, recalling only an endless cycle of misery. The demoness reminded her that their kind never lets go of a grudge or forgives an enemy. But she assured Beryl that Belith would treat her right. However, she immediately sensed that something else regarding her brother was still bothering the saint. The silver-haired demoness noticed that Beryl was troubled by something. She directly asked the saint if her worries were related to Belith. An embarrassed Beryl admitted she was awkward talking about it, but she found herself looking forward to seeing him each night. Her companion replied that if she loved him, then that was only natural. However, the saint began to doubt. She wondered what exactly she was looking forward to more, the coming of night or seeing Belith himself. The girl admitted she couldn't fully understand her feelings. She wasn't sure if she enjoyed her husband's company as a person or if she just enjoyed their time in bed. She was tormented by the question, what if Belith truly loved her while she only desired him for the pleasure he provided her? After listening to these confessions, the demoness only hummed thoughtfully. In her opinion, the saint's insecurity was something Belith himself had to work on. She suggested that Beryl stop blaming herself and look at it differently. If Belith also thought of her as someone to satisfy his desires, then they were both good partners for one another. The woman added that even if someone thought their relationship was a problem, no one would dare intervene. Beryl realized that her emotions and their relationship were solely their own business. Rising, the demoness gave the saint one last piece of advice. There was no need to rush things. She reminded Beryl that time flows much slower for demons than for humans. The mysterious stranger assured Beryl that she and her husband had plenty of time to fully understand their feelings for each other. To her, this meant only one thing. There would be plenty of time ahead to watch what other interesting and exciting events would unfold in this mansion. When the saint tried to stop the guest, she only began to gracefully withdraw. Beryl desperately pleaded for her to wait, not wanting to cut such an important conversation short. The woman noted with regret that their time was up, though she would have loved to hear more from Beryl. Before finally vanishing into the shadows, she at last introduced herself as Folklore of the Other Side. She let the saint know that she could always find her in the basement if she ever wanted to have another heart-to-heart talk. Left alone, Beryl felt as though everything that had happened was just a strange dream. She was plagued by a single question. How does Folklore manage to pass through the Hellgate so easily? Meanwhile, the castle's silence was broken by the heavy footsteps of the returning warriors. The squad in black cloaks moved confidently through the halls, drawing everyone's attention. The servants were shocked by Nibirius's sudden return. Everyone around felt a wave of incredibly powerful energy emanating from the mysterious chest in the general's hands. Nibirius knocked on the Duke's study door, officially reporting his arrival. He tried to maintain his composure, though a storm of realization over his loss raged within him. Veled met his general alongside Beryl. The saint warmly welcomed the warrior back from his successful mission, while the duke silently awaited the results of the dangerous foray. Nibirius reluctantly raised the chest, confirming that the legendary Devil's Chalice was now in their possession. The demon cursed everything, having not expected Beryl to be present during this report to witness his defeat. The lid of the chest clicked open, and the room was flooded with a blinding, magical radiance. The relic was indeed there, serving as final proof of the saint's absolute correctness. Recalling his journey back, Nibirius felt completely crushed. He rode through the night, realizing that because of a stupid bet, his reputation as a great warrior had turned to ash. The demon admitted he had made a fatal mistake by underestimating Beryl. He no longer dared to call her that woman. From now on, she was her ladyship, whose status had become undeniable in his eyes. Looking at the first rays of the sun, the general let out a heavy sigh of helplessness. He understood that his life would now be subject to the will of a human he had despised just yesterday. Returning to reality, Nibirius gathered his courage once more and knocked on the door, preparing to see the matter through to the end. He raised the artifact before the spouses again, cursing to himself. The saint's presence made him feel utterly humiliated, as the Devil's Chalice in his hands was the ultimate symbol of his surrender to her foresight. Nibirius opened the chest, and Beryl froze in astonishment. Inside lay the legendary Devil's Chalice itself, radiating ancient and terrifying power. The girl couldn't suppress a gasp as the relic began to pulse with a brilliant light. The artifact's energy instantly filled the entire study. Beryl carefully took the chalice into her hands, wondering why the object was reacting so strangely to her touch. In that very instant, the artifact flared up with renewed intensity. The saint felt flows of pure magic literally piercing through her entire body. The demons present recoiled in horror, feeling unbearable pressure. They couldn't comprehend what incredible energy had awakened in the saint's hands. A massive pillar of magical light erupted from the castle, shaking the earth and tinting the sky with shades of purple. The resonance was so strong that it was felt for miles around. Velid watched silently as his wife held the artifact while a magical storm raged all around them. Nibirius watched the spectacle with reverent awe. He got goosebumps from the realization that he was witnessing the impossible. The Duke reached a shocking conclusion. The Devil's Chalice, which had obeyed no one for centuries, was now in complete resonance with Beryl's soul. Beryl was confused, staring at the dazzling brilliance of the cup. She didn't understand why the ancient artifact was shining so brightly in her hands. Belov explained that the Devil's Chalice always reacts to the strength and depth of the innermost desires of the one holding it. The Duke added that even among his fellow demons, only a few possess the will sufficient to properly wield the power of this relic. It turned out that Beryl's inner aspirations were incredibly powerful. The girl blushed deeply with embarrassment, wondering if she was actually such a greedy person. The man only gave a mysterious smile in response to her fears, stating that such a passionate nature was exactly what befitted a true Archduchess of Baine. He added with confidence that fate itself had destined them to be together, since the artifact had so willingly recognized her authority. The saint covered her face with her hands, feeling herself grow weak from his candid speech. She was amazed at how Belith could say such intimate things so casually and confidently. Nibirius watched this idol in total shock. It was extremely awkward and strange for him to see his stern lord in such an unusually cheerful mood. The general literally crumbled from the realization of his own shame. He was plagued by guilt, unable to understand how he could have been so rude to a woman who turned out to be the true salvation for their family. Beryl turned to Nibirius with a triumphant smile. She reminded him of their bet, directly asking if the discovery of the chalice didn't mean her unconditional victory. The dejected general could barely raise his eyes. He had no choice but to humbly admit his defeat and call her my lady. However, Beryl had no intention of humiliating him. With a sweet smile, she suggested they just become good friends. But for the proud demon, this was unthinkable. He bowed low, offering 1,000 apologies for his audacity. Suddenly, Velid's cold voice interrupted the conversation. He crossed his arms over his chest and demanded an explanation for what exactly his general was so humiliatingly apologizing for. Nibirius froze in fear. It was one thing to admit defeat to a woman, and quite another to explain his transgression to his master. Unable to find words, the demon dropped to his knees. He begged for forgiveness, imploring the Duke to punish him as he saw fit. Prostrating himself on the floor, Nibirius confessed his sins. He admitted he had been unforgivably rude to her ladyship and, even worse, had dared to question the wisdom of the Duke's own choice. In despair, the general declared he was ready to meekly accept even death if the Duke deemed it a just punishment. Velid watched this scene in silence. His gaze was icy and piercing as he assessed the sincerity of his best warrior's repentance. Beryl stood up for Nibirius, stating that questioning decisions was a general's direct duty. But Velid was adamant. He was furious that the warrior had dared to be rude to his wife. With a smile, the saint added that she had already forgiven the demon and held no grudge against him. Nibirius accepted her mercy with relief. The Duke, however, told him to leave, not wanting to see his face any longer. The general shot out of the study, not believing his luck and just glad to be alive. Left alone, Beryl was finally able to examine the legendary Devil's Chalice up close. Velid warned that touching the artifact could drive ordinary humans mad and asked her to be careful. He demanded that the saint stop looking at the chalice, as its energy had a negative effect on mortals. The Duke slammed the chest shut, while Beryl recalled that in her past life, this relic had caused strange phenomena in the lands of Ubar. Beryl recounted how in her past life, Duke Ubar had ignored people's complaints about the anomalies, dismissing them as their ignorance. Velid listened with a grim expression as his wife contemptuously called Ubar a despicable human. With a predatory smile, Beryl announced her intention to report the finding to the temple. The Duke froze, not understanding why she would attract the attention of their common enemies. The Devil's Chalice was a sacred relic for demons, their source of life and power. However, for ordinary humans, its energy was a deadly poison, capable of driving them mad and killing them. Velid asked in surprise if she really wanted to report such a dangerous artifact to the temple. He demanded an immediate explanation, not understanding what game his wife was playing. Beryl calmly explained that the priests were terrified of taking risks, and it was this weakness she intended to exploit. Beryl added that what the priests hated most was dealing with demons directly. She reminded Velid of how cowardly the clergy had been acting lately. They had suddenly changed the date of the grand prayer. They also fled the wedding reception under a flimsy pretext, just to avoid staying at the Baine estate. Beryl was certain that the temple would want nothing to do with demons, even if it involved such a powerful artifact. Therefore, she would announce to the priests that she was taking the Devil's Chalice under her personal charge as a saint. By doing this, she would play the role of a noble and self-sacrificing maiden. Exactly what the priests wanted to see in her. This move would allow them to keep the artifact and channel its magic for the good of the Baine family without raising any suspicion. The Duke chuckled and admitted that, for a moment, he actually thought she was planning to give the relic to the temple. Beryl recoiled in horror, vehemently denying such a possibility and regretting that she hadn't explained her cunning plan more carefully. Beryl started to explain her plan, but Velid stopped her, gently touching her chin. He reminded her that an ordinary human dies from a single touch of the chalice, and demanded to know how she was able to resonate with it. The Duke stated with confidence that he thought he knew the answer to that question. In his opinion, all the wishes and desires Beryl had accumulated over her 2 past lives had carried over into her current incarnation, greatly amplifying her inner will. These emotions grew and strengthened until they spun out of control, becoming a force capable of influencing ancient artifacts. Meanwhile, preparations for the inspection were in full swing at the castle. De Carabia reported to her lady that the main part of the estate's redecoration and renovation was complete. Beryl noted with satisfaction that everything was going smoothly, and they would be ready in time for the priest's arrival. Beryl found herself reflecting on how much her attitude toward the demons living in the castle had changed. Most importantly, her relationship with Belith had evolved from a mere alliance into a deep and passionate bond. Recalling their intimacy, the saint couldn't help but blush, realizing that her feelings were becoming stronger and more intimate. However, personal feelings had to be set aside, as only fine details in the mansion's decor remained to be finished before the inspection. While walking with De Carabia, Beryl noted that in real aristocratic homes, every room must be filled with charming trinkets and decorations. Suddenly, she stopped before a magnificent eagle statue on a fountain and was struck by its incredible craftsmanship. The assistant explained that it was the work of a demon named Marbas, and for him, creating such sculptures was merely a common hobby. Beryl carefully examined the statue's details and realized it was a masterpiece, created by a true artist. Then ordered to fetch the sculptor immediately. Marbas, known as the Plague Demon, soon appeared. He looked nervous and hurried to explain that infusing metal with his magical power required a massive amount of energy. Beryl offered Marba to use the power of the Devil's Chalice for his work. She promised him full access to the relic so the demon could create decorations without depleting his own magic reserves. Marbas was stunned by his mistress's generosity and the artifact's power. Trembling with excitement, he promised to fulfill the assignment perfectly, taking responsibility for the magical transformation of the interior. Soon the castle was completely transformed. Majestic statues and elegant portraits shining with magical light appeared in the halls. The estate began to look truly luxurious and high status. Velid, passing through the corridors, noticed the unfamiliar decorative items. The demon accompanying him found these changes suspicious and offered to remove everything immediately. The Duke ordered the items to be left in place, guessing it was Beryl's initiative. However, he was alarmed by the unusual swarm of demons on the floor where his spouse lived. The assistant explained that the servants were literally drawn to the saint. Beryl's powerful, pure energy filled the space, becoming a life-giving source of strength for the castle's inhabitants. Veled grew somber, realizing that his wife's allure could turn into danger for her. The subordinates only watched in silence as their master's dissatisfaction grew. The man ordered an increase in Beryl's security detail. He commanded to detain and report anyone suspicious who dared to go near the Duchess. According to the Duke's will, the saint was introduced to her new bodyguards. A group of elite female warriors received strict orders to protect their lady from any threats. The new bodyguards officially vowed to keep the saint safe. Beryl was confused by such a sudden change in her security detail. The girl wondered if she was in real danger. She appreciated Veled's concern, but anxiety was growing in her heart. Beryl was bothered that her husband had made such an important decision without discussing it with her first. Left alone, the saint watched the silence of the estate, sinking into deep thought. The Duke's excessive concern felt both exciting and frighteningly stifling to her. Beryl suddenly asked Decarabia about Focalor, causing the assistant genuine astonishment. The maid confirmed she knew this demoness and was shocked that the saint knew that name. Beryl spoke of the secret meeting in the basement and invited Decarabia to go there together. The assistant tried to stop her lady, considering a personal visit to such a creature pure madness. The saint insisted on her way, wanting to discuss an important matter with Focalor that gave her no rest. Deep in the basement, Focalor greeted her guest, calling her a child and noting the time passed since their last meeting. Beryl was shocked by Focalor's sudden appearance, wondering how she could materialize so quickly. The demoness explained it wasn't about her will, but rather that her magic was now flowing much more smoothly. The saint immediately realized that the reason for such changes was the Devil's Chalice, whose energy filled the estate. Focalor confirmed that the ancient artifact, thought to be long lost, had finally been found. She acknowledged that Beryl, through her actions, had literally brought light and hope to all the demons of this world. The demoness suggested postponing their private talk, giving the saint a meaningful wink that left the girl confused. First and foremost, Focalor demanded that the Devil's Chalice be brought to her to perform her mysterious rituals. Using the relic's power, she planned to strengthen her second body and ordered an immediate audience with that boy, Belith. While Veled was immersed in paperwork, Decarabia entered the study and reported that Focalor was waiting for him in the basement, requesting his presence. Veled stood frozen in shock upon seeing the guest. He barely managed to utter the word, "sister," unable to believe she had actually returned. Focalor was known as the demon of the other side. She had a sinister reputation. She knew how to expose the ugliest side of demons, and no one who crossed her had ever survived. The essence of her power lay in her silver tongue and special magic. She possessed the frightening ability to naturally draw out a person's true, even most hidden feelings. Veled looked at her with a heavy heart, realizing it had been an eternity since he had actually spoken those words or interacted with her as family. The news of Lady Focalor's return spread through the castle instantly. Lesser demons were terrified. They couldn't believe that this legendary figure was back in action. Servants whispered in the corners about something incredible. Saint Beryl had not only found the relic, but had somehow brought folklore back to their world. The saint's authority in the eyes of the castle inhabitants skyrocketed. Folklore reached for the devil's chalice, explaining the mechanics of her existence. The further this temporary vessel was from her real body, the more magic she required to maintain her form. However, with the power of the chalice now available, she was no longer restricted and could go anywhere she wanted. Beryl, having carefully listened to the explanation about the body projection, asked the most crucial question. Where was the demoness's real body actually hidden? Folklore explained the nature of her appearance to Beryl. Since the gate of hell was still too narrow, her true physical body could not pass through. She emphasized that her current form was merely a projection that would vanish instantly if the saint doubted her existence. Touching the girl's face, the demoness revealed a chilling truth. While this form was present here, her real body remained in a state of eternal dreaming. After this, Folklore began to withdraw, leaving Beryl in complete confusion as she realized the complexity of the magical laws governing high demons. Folklore's appearance in the mansion's halls caused a genuine shock among the local inhabitants. The demon servants couldn't believe their eyes, as the legendary lady had been in hibernation for centuries and was considered unreachable. Rumors of their new mistress's incredible influence spread among the monsters. The demons discussed how no one could wake Folklore despite the most desperate pleas, and only Archduchess Beryl had managed the impossible by bringing her back to this world. Folklore appeared before her brother in all her glory, noting with an ironic smile how long it had been since their last meeting. Veled was visibly stunned and troubled. His sister immediately began teasing him, calling him a scoundrel for managing to get married while she was away. The Duke only sighed heavily, admitting he never thought she would return. To the silent question regarding the reasons for her awakening, Folklore merely gave a flirtatious shrug. She stated that with so much fun happening in the estate, she couldn't afford to keep sleeping. The trio gathered in the study for a serious conversation. Beleth and Beryl understood that with the return of the demon of the other side, their plans to protect the estate from the temple's inspection had taken on an entirely new scale. Folklore noted that the castle was still stuck in eternal night. She emphasized that darkness had become a permanent companion for the inhabitants. Beleth explained that because the Hellgate was closed, there wasn't enough magic in the estate even to maintain the illusion of daytime. The demoness mysteriously hinted that bringing back the daytime might also be someone's desire, alluding to the chalice's hidden power. Beryl reached a grim conclusion. As long as the temple exists, God can watch over them through the sun. The girl seriously wondered what would happen to the world if the temple simply ceased to exist one day. Beleth sharply interrupted his sister, ordering her not to even think about putting such a heavy burden on Beryl. He stepped in front of his wife protectively. Folklore just brushed it off, stating she wasn't there for that. She was much more interested in their failed love story. This remark completely confused the saint, making her wonder exactly what the demoness meant. Folklore looked away sadly and confessed that once, a long time ago, she too had known the power of love. Folklore admitted that she realized her feelings for the man she loved far too late. Even when he married someone else, she didn't understand her own heart and only realized the truth after he had died. Until the very end, he remained nothing more than a loyal friend to her. The demoness bitterly recalled the moment of his passing, realizing how many words have been left unsaid. This man knew her true nature, but kept silent, accepting her exactly as she was. It was he who taught a powerful demon the true meaning of regret. They never gathered the courage to ask each other about their feelings, so their story remained unfinished, leaving behind nothing but an eternal emptiness. Folklore sternly warned Beleth and Beryl not to repeat her mistakes. She insisted that they be honest with each other and never leave their relationship in uncertainty. The demoness sincerely wished for the couple to find the happiness she herself had once dreamed of, but could never obtain. Her words left the spouses deep in thought. Shifting to a lighter tone, she promised that, for Beryl's peace of mind, she would no longer pressure them with her lectures. Folklore touched the chalice, preparing for her imminent departure. She assured the saint that she could call for her help at any time, promising to appear whenever needed as long as she still possessed the strength and magic. After Folklore vanished, a heavy silence settled over the balcony. Beryl and Beleth stood shoulder to shoulder, gazing at the night sky and processing everything they had heard from the demon of the other side. Belith was surprised that his usually reserved sister had opened up to Beryl so quickly. The saint, meanwhile, grew genuinely nervous, fearing her husband might discover that she had been asking for advice about their intimacy. The Duke sensed his wife's unease and gently whispered that she could share any worries with him. He promised to give her all the time she needed until she felt safe enough to speak. Beryl's heart pounded wildly. She was still tormented by uncertainty. Did she truly value Belith as a person, or was she only drawn to him because of the passion he had awakened within her? The girl promised she would open up later, admitting that her concerns were directly related to Belith himself, which was why she wasn't ready for an honest conversation yet. The history of the world claimed that long ago, humans had declared demons to be the embodiment of evil and their greatest enemies. The temple tirelessly spread the belief that the demon race had been eternally cursed by God. The priests convinced the people that monsters brought nothing but plague and disaster, and that heaven's will was their complete extermination. The true nature of demons remained a mystery, while stories of their cruelty were deliberately exaggerated by the temple to strengthen its grip on power. The priests officially proclaimed that God had abandoned the demons, making their destruction a sacred duty for every human. Instead of killing one another, humans united against a common enemy, believing in the existence of a greater evil in the form of demons. Demons were simply honest about their desire for magic, but their true motives eventually became irrelevant to humanity. In response, the temple focused on spreading rumors about the terrifying powers of demons, calling for their complete eradication. People were told that demons used their magic solely to accumulate immeasurable wealth. Legends claimed that the lands inhabited by these creatures were literally overflowing with gold and treasures. While some humans feared the demons' power, others saw these rumors as an opportunity for quick enrichment. Killing a demon and seizing its wealth was no longer considered a sin, becoming a path to glory and the title of hero for many mercenaries. Believing the saint's words that demons were hiding there, crowds of fortune seekers set out toward the Baine estate. The first group of armed men reached their destination, but instead of the promised hordes of monsters, they saw only a quiet city under the night sky. The fortune seekers were certain that demons had been robbing humans for years and were eager to find the treasures in the Baine lands. Meanwhile, at the castle, evening had come, and Beryl noticed that Belith hadn't touched his paperwork all day. The Duke admitted he had completely lost track of time, mesmerized by watching his wife work. The girl realized her husband had spent hours just staring at her and offered her help to clear the backlog of work. Seeing that their being in the study together hindered Velid's concentration, the saint suggested setting up a separate workspace for herself. A long pause followed, during which the Duke silently and intently studied Beryl's face. Eventually, he agreed and ordered Ronove to immediately find and prepare a suitable room for his wife's office. Beryl said a warm goodbye to her husband until the next morning and left the study. Left alone, Velid decided to finish his work in record time to reunite with Beryl as soon as possible. He clenched his fists in impatience, as his only desire now was to be with the woman he loved as quickly as possible. Velid received an alarming report that Duke Orobas had begun gathering beast carcasses on a massive scale. Over time, the remains of these creatures began to emit an extremely deadly poison, posing a threat not only to humans, but to demons as well. The temple had always closely monitored how such remains were disposed of, so any of Orobas's machinations could attract unwanted attention from the Inquisition. The Duke understood that if this information came to light, it might seriously bother Beryl and disturb her peace. He ordered his subordinates to find clear evidence that the carcasses were indeed being gathered and to find out exactly how and why Orobas was disposing of them. Velid specifically ordered that the safety of the villagers be ensured, so that none of them would be harmed during the investigation. His subordinate expressed confusion, questioning whether they should care so much about humans when their own energy supply was depleted. However, the Duke made the protection of humans a priority task. He knew that if Beryl were in his place, she would have put the lives of ordinary mortals first, without hesitation. Meanwhile, Beryl, walking through the estate, noticed that it was unusually dark and uncomfortable in the castle today. The girl walked down the corridor, lost in her thoughts. She was still surprised that Belith had agreed to separate their offices so easily, even though she was almost certain he would want to keep her by his side. Beryl was plagued by doubts. It stung her that Belith had agreed to the separate offices so quickly. She began to fear that he wasn't serious about their relationship. The girl blamed herself for getting ahead of herself. feeling foolish for taking their late-night counseling and intimacy so seriously. To distract her mistress from dark thoughts, Dicarabia pointed toward the garden. Marba, using the power of the chalice, had already finished its large-scale decoration. Beryl was amazed by the speed of the work, but the assistant reminded her, lending the devil's chalice carried great weight, and Marba had to deliver or return the relic. Examining the elaborate metal structures, the saint was in awe of the craftsman's talent. She couldn't believe such intricate things could be forged from metal. However, as soon as Beryl tapped the statue's surface, a strange buzzing sound erupted. She realized that a dangerous and unstable magic was emanating from the metal. In the next instant, a powerful surge of energy occurred. Beryl was blasted back, and Dicarabia cried out in horror, rushing to protect her lady as things went south. Flows of uncontrolled magic enveloped the saint. The castle shuddered from a burst of power that had clearly entered a dangerous resonance with Beryl's body. The garden lit up with a blinding radiance as magical seals manifested on the ground. A simple attempt to decorate the grounds had turned into a full-scale disaster right before the inspection. Veled suddenly felt the air in the castle saturate with unstable magic. His face froze in a grim premonition. He realized that something catastrophic had happened in the garden. At that very second, a deafening explosion thundered. A powerful shockwave blew out the massive doors, turning them into splinters and filling the corridors with dust and debris. Deep cracks began to crawl across the mansion's marble floor. The magical outburst was so intense that the building shuddered to its very foundation, foreshadowing imminent disaster. Seized by panic, the Duke dashed forward, reaching incredible speed. He was panting heavily, and only one name pulsed in his head: the name of his wife. Bursting onto the scene, Veled froze. Before his eyes was the sight he feared seeing most. Beryl lay unconscious in Dicarabia's arms. The assistant desperately shook the saint by her shoulders, pleading for her to open her eyes. The girl showed no signs of life, while the magical field around her continued to spark. Beryl's face was deathly pale. A thin trickle of blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. Her human body could not withstand the devastating resonance with the ancient artifact. A deathly silence fell over the mansion. The chambers they had decorated so carefully were transformed in an instant into a place of tragedy, plunged into cold stillness. An ominous rumble continued to echo from the depths of the castle, while the corridors were flooded with the crimson light of sunset. Veled realized that this time, fate had dealt its cruelest blow. Marba trembled with terror, absolutely certain that this day would be his last. Veled looked down at his general and demanded an immediate explanation in an icy tone. Marbas was surprised he hadn't been killed on the spot and realized he had one last chance to justify himself. He immediately confessed his crime, prostrating himself in a deep, repentant bow. The demon reminded the Duke of the constant human raids that had recently been violating the borders of the Vine estate. He admitted to secretly infusing all the metal decorations Beryl had commissioned with poison magic. Marbas planned to create a trap for trespassers, but accidentally enchanted the decor inside the manor as well. The warriors swore the poison wasn't lethal and that her ladyship had merely fainted from the sudden magical shock. Veled clenched his fist in fury. The words about there being no threat to his wife's life could not appease his anger that Beryl had suffered because of his subject's fault. Veled learned a terrifying detail. Beryl had been vomiting blood before she collapsed. The Duke flew into a rage upon hearing how lightly his subjects justified their fatal mistakes. He issued a harsh ultimatum to the general. If the saint did not wake up within 2 days, Marba would pay for it with his life. Dicarabia admitted her oversight, explaining that years at the temple had made Beryl's body too vulnerable to magic. Veled sighed heavily, trying to suppress the anger and anxiety tearing him apart from within. The Duke ordered everyone to leave the room immediately, wanting to be alone with his wife during this difficult moment. Late at night, Veled sat by Beryl's bed, never taking his eyes off her, while the devil's chalice shimmered dimly nearby. Looking at his spouse's pale face, he quietly asked for her forgiveness for failing to protect her. The man sank into deep sorrow, realizing how fragile the life of the woman who had become his reason for existing truly was. Folklore found Veled by his sleeping wife's bed and ironically remarked that staring intensely wouldn't wake her up. The Duke recognized the guest as his sister. The demoness sensed a trace of weak green magic on Beryl. and immediately guessed that it was the result of Marbaz's interference. She directly asked her brother if he had killed the person responsible for the incident. Veled looked extremely exhausted and depressed. He admitted that he had indeed intended to execute Marba, but refrained, fearing that Beryl would be beside herself with grief. This amused Folklore. She knew that the old Belith would have destroyed the offender 1,000 times over, and she was surprised by his newfound restraint. His sister assured him that the saint would wake up soon and couldn't understand why her brother looked so grim. Veled only held his head in despair. The Duke confessed that lately he had been in total confusion due to new emotions that frightened him. He explained that a strange feeling bubbled up inside him every time Beryl showed kindness to someone or made others smile. But all that oppressive weight vanished instantly, the moment the girl turned and rushed into his arms with sincere joy. Veled confessed to his sister that Beryl's distant look whenever she was lost in thought frightened him. In those moments, a dark urge awakened within him to force her to reveal everything she was thinking. The Duke was terrified that if he gave in to his true nature and acted selfishly, Beryl would simply leave him. He realized he could no longer control the feelings that Belith had always considered a weakness. Folklore reminded her brother that no one was as honest about their desires as he was. She advised him to look deep within himself and answer honestly what he truly wanted. At that moment, Veled froze, trying to grasp the true nature of his attraction to the saint. The man suddenly remembered a conversation with his sister that had taken place many centuries ago in their distant past. Back then, Folklore had first confessed to her brother that she believed she had truly fallen in love with a human. Veled had coldly asked whether that feeling was nothing more than the usual demonic urge to possess someone or completely dominate another's will. But his sister explained that her feelings were far more complex than a thirst for power. She wanted to share both sorrow and joy with the one she loved, wishing for his happiness just as much as her own. Looking at the sleeping Beryl, Veled finally found his answer. He became certain that his fierce desire was not merely a monster's whim, but true love. Folklore guessed what her brother was thinking, and only murmured thoughtfully that now he finally understood. Before disappearing, she cast a glance at the demonic chalice. Beryl fell into a nightmare where her first husband, Duke Orobas, appeared before her once again. He mockingly asked if the saint still refused to share a bed with him. Orobas claimed that she would end up with him anyway and called her attempts to resist a foolish act. Beryl tossed in her delirium, desperately trying to break free from the vision until a voice called out her name. She sat up abruptly in bed, panting heavily. Her heart was racing, and her forehead was covered in cold sweat from the shock she had endured. Veled had been sitting by her bed the entire time. He gently called his wife and asked with deep concern if she was all right. Regaining her senses, Beryl began to question her husband about what had happened in the garden. A tense atmosphere filled the room as Belith explained the details of the incident. Upon learning of Marbaz's remorse, the saint clenched the sheets tightly. She asked Veled not to punish the craftsman, believing that his admission and apology were enough to make amends. Veled thought Beryl was showing far too much mercy. He stated that no one would blame her if she chose to punish Marba for his fatal mistake. However, the girl sharply objected, turning away. She admitted that she wasn't actually as kind or generous as she might seem at first glance. Beryl revealed her true motive. By sparing Marba's life, she had made him indebted to her. Now she held his weakness in her hands, giving her a strategic advantage in the castle. Veled was genuinely amused by this calculation. With a sly smile, he asked what kind of weakness of his own he should offer her so that she could manipulate him as well. At such a direct and intimate suggestion, the saint immediately blushed, once again feeling flustered by her husband's boldness. The Duke then changed his tone to a more serious one and brought up her nightmare. He admitted that he had seen how much she struggled and tossed in her sleep before finally waking up. Beryl honestly admitted that she had dreamed about her time at the Orobas estate, memories of her first life, which had been filled with humiliation. Veled was pierced by a cold fury at the mention of her past tormentor. He directly asked what exactly that man had done to her in that reality. Beryl admitted to Veled that in her past life, Duke Orobas never did anything selflessly. He always demanded something in return. Those demands never seemed to end. Orobas constantly drilled into her head the idea that nothing in life comes for free. Almost everything that came out of that man's mouth disgusted the saint. but his words about paying for everything sounded frighteningly sincere. The girl had grown used to believing that no one in this world would give everything without expecting something in return. And yet, Veled cared for her so deeply that Beryl couldn't stop asking herself, what was it that he truly wanted from her? Clasping her husband's hands, the saint bitterly admitted that she felt useless. She believed the only valuable thing she could offer him was her magical power. Veled gently stroked her hand, assuring her that he had never kept score or looked for any gain in their relationship. The Duke confessed that all he truly wanted was for her to simply stay by his side. In the end, he asked what exactly she had seen in her nightmare that made her doubt him again. Veled asked what exactly in the nightmare had caused Beryl so much pain. The girl admitted that she would rather forget the memories of her time at the Orobas estate forever. The Orobas family publicly called themselves a holy family, yet their true actions proved that they were anything but righteous. In the deep basement of their castle, they hid a secret method for producing holy water that no one was supposed to know about. The shocking truth lay in their secret recipe. They manufactured holy water from the carcasses of slaughtered monsters. Veled noted that this should have been physically impossible since the two substances possessed opposite properties, but a secret method made the merger a reality. That secret method was magic, the only power capable of forcing such unnatural elements to combine. Beryl realized the gravity of the situation. The temple would strictly denounce the use of magic in holy rituals, branding the Orobas family as heretics. The saint concluded that turning monster remains into holy water was not a natural phenomenon or a divine miracle, but a perverted alchemical act. She understood that if they were truly making holy water using magic, it would serve as definitive proof that the Orobas family were actually demons. Veled proposed a daring plan to Beryl: to secretly steal the evidence from the dungeon beneath Orobas's castle and reveal it to everyone on the altar during the upcoming gate-opening ceremony. Meanwhile, at the Orobas estate, a servant reported to the Duke that their plan was taking more time and effort than they had expected. Orobas was issuing orders to his subordinates. He commanded them to seal the monster remains inside coffins, as the carcasses would begin releasing deadly poison when exposed to open air. The servants complained about how difficult the task was. They grumbled about having to put in so much effort and wished there were a way to collect them all at once. Even though the chosen method was not the most efficient, the Duke insisted on it, convinced that only this approach would guarantee a perfect result. At the same time, Orobas ordered preparations to begin for a grand banquet. He demanded that the event be organized with the greatest possible luxury and scale. The assistants obediently accepted their lord's orders and immediately set out to carry them out. A cook who accidentally overheard the conversation was horrified. Hearing about poison and the mass collection of bodies, he realized he had stumbled into something sinister and decided to flee the estate immediately. The tension escalated when sudden news arrived. An official invitation had been delivered from Duke Orobas himself. Beryl and Veled began analyzing the situation together, trying to unravel Duke Orobas's true motives. Veled concluded that the monster carcasses being actively collected by Orobas's men were essentially just expendable materials for some dark purpose. Beryl suggested that if the poison from the remains wasn't the main ingredient, then the Duke was likely planning to use the lavish banquet as a distraction for a large-scale transportation of the bodies. She realized that in the chaos, with dozens of carriages constantly arriving and leaving, transporting such suspicious cargo wouldn't raise any suspicion at all. In the invitation they received, Orobas claimed that his house had become the victim of an unfortunate misunderstanding and invited priests and nobles to a banquet to publicly prove his devotion to the light. Beryl recalled her past life. Back then, the Duke's attempt to create holy water had ended in failure, but this time, he might have prepared much better. The girl realized the enemy's plan. If Orobas succeeded in creating a substitute, he could clear himself of all suspicion of dealing with the devil simply by drinking the water in front of the inspectors. Veled confirmed that his spies were still reporting the ongoing collection of carcasses, meaning Orobas had not yet achieved the desired result in his experiments. Beryl understood that the only way to win was to prevent them from completing the formula, but she admitted that doing so under the current circumstances would be nearly impossible. Beryl decided to frame the House of Orobas as the House of the Devil during the upcoming gathering. She realized that branding the Duke a demon at the ceremony would finally cause the gates of hell to open. Veled confirmed her theory, but warned of the danger. If Orobas was proven innocent, suspicion would shift back to the Vine family or Duke Ubar. The saint then suggested a double blow, accusing Duke Ubar as well, since he already worshipped demons and constantly tried to summon them. She planned to add special effects to his sigils to make his summoning rituals look irrefutably demonic. Her plan involved using actual demon worshippers who wanted to weaken the temple to help stage the provocation. Veled agreed with the logic. While Orobas was being accused, they would draw Ubar into the trap. They anticipated that Ubar would try to help Orobas, mistakenly thinking he was a fellow demon. This would lead the war-weary temple to brand both of them as monsters. The ultimate goal was to have both Ubar and Orobas sacrificed on the altar, using their blood to open the gates for good. Beryl realized that her plan would force the temple to open the gates of hell with their own hands. She felt an unprecedented sense of freedom, understanding that she could finally express her opinions openly and influence the course of history. The girl reflected on how her active interference in demonic affairs might have seemed excessive to Belith. However, instead of disapproval, she saw only deep and sincere respect for her will in her husband's eyes. The Duke formally bowed to his wife, acknowledging her status and her right to make decisions on equal terms with him. In a moment of intimacy, Veled gently leaned toward his wife, ignoring Dekarabia's presence in the room. A flustered Beryl, blushing deeply, playfully pushed her husband away, trying to remind him about proper manners in front of the maid. Getting down to business, Veled ordered his men to place the Orobas estate under surveillance. He also instructed them to begin large-scale preparations for Beryl's first official appearance in high society, as they were about to attend the enemy's banquet. Before leaving, the Duke remembered another important request from his wife that had been on her mind. He confirmed that he remembered the kind chef Beryl had mentioned earlier. Veled assured her that his men were already searching for the man and arranging his rescue. It became clear that the chef of House Orobas would soon be dismissed and secretly transferred to the Baine estate, where he would be safe under the Duke's protection. Veled informed her that they would be moving to the countryside villa to prepare for the banquet. The estate was located right on the border between day and night. Servants began actively loading the carriages with supplies and luggage. Beryl watched the preparations for their departure from the window. Upon arriving, the girl was amazed by the unusual sky. She had never seen light and darkness meet so strangely in one place before. The lad explained that he had built this house on the border of the worlds on purpose. It allowed him to personally oversee matters involving demons in this region. Beryl asked why Decarabia couldn't travel with them. Her husband explained that sunlight drained the assistant's strength, so other guards would replace her. The Duke led his wife inside the villa, intending to personally show her the chambers that had been prepared for her. They walked through luxurious corridors filled with sunlight. Beryl looked around with curiosity, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The saint's new room was flooded with bright sunlight. It was a stark contrast to the familiar darkness of the main castle. Veled apologized, saying he needed to deal with some matters since he hadn't been here for a long time. He promised to return to her later. Before leaving, Veled pressed a passionate kiss to Beryl's lips, sealing their unspoken alliance. He gently touched her face and promised to return as soon as possible, leaving the girl blushing at the unexpected tenderness. The Duke left the chambers, while the saint remained standing by the door, trying to manage the surge of emotions and anxiety within her. Soon the maids arrived and informed her that a hot bath had been prepared so she could relax. Once in the water, Beryl felt a strange heaviness. Despite the abundant sunlight in the room, the warmth felt foreign and unsettling. The bright sun of the country villa brought her no comfort, only a stifling sense of oppression. In the evening, Beryl confessed to her husband that the sun, which she hadn't seen in so long, had exhausted her, and she decided to go to bed early. Sitting on the bed, she pondered the closeness of the Orobas lands. Being near her past tormentor stirred the darkest memories within her. Veled approached her and carefully remarked that she risked catching a cold if she didn't dry her wet hair before sleeping. Veled began to gently massage Beryl's neck, ignoring her protests. The girl felt embarrassed and tried to insist she could do it herself, but the Duke softly insisted on helping. He noted that since the sunlight made her so uncomfortable, she had clearly grown accustomed to life in the darkness of Vine. Beryl was forced to admit he was right and gave in to his touch. The saint expressed her desire to get the upcoming banquet over with quickly so they could hurry back to Vine. Veled solicitously helped her with her clothes, supporting her wish. Continuing the massage, The Duke agreed that they needed to wrap things up as fast as possible. His touch made Beryl forget all the day's worries. The conversation turned to business. Velid mentioned that Duke Ubar was holding another demon summoning ceremony today. He informed her that Nibirius had been sent to handle it. The man suggested ending the talk and focusing on each other for the night. He saw how tired Beryl was and wanted to devote the entire evening to her. The girl tried to object, pointing out that it was still early and the maids were right outside. However, Velid had already ordered all servants to vacate the floor until morning. Realizing they were completely alone, Beryl yielded. Velid embraced her tightly, promising to help keep her nightmares away throughout the night. The wind rustled through the trees around the villa as a long-awaited peace and silence finally settled over the couple's chambers. Dangerous beasts awakened in the forests of Ubar. The atmosphere grew tense as monsters began prowling in search of prey. Predatory demons sniffed the air, sensing the approach of something unusual and frightening. Duke Ubar faced failure once again, staring at the blood-stained floor of his laboratory. He mockingly thought of Orobas's attempts to prove his sanctity, considering them pathetic. Ubar was tormented by fear. If Orobas managed to clear his name with the temple, then Ubar himself would be the next victim, sacrificed as the true demon. The thought of opening the Heaven's Gate terrified him, as it meant the ultimate downfall for all his plans and followers. The Duke was visibly nervous, realizing that time was running out, and his position was becoming increasingly precarious. Refusing to give up, Ubar ordered his men to immediately begin the 1746th summoning ceremony, hoping for success. In the midst of the rite, one of the cultists noticed a strange stirring in the shadows. It seemed to him that this time, the ritual was actually yielding results. The magical sigil on the floor suddenly flared with a crimson light. Ubar froze in shock as space began to warp under the influence of an unknown power. The summoning ritual ended with a powerful, magical explosion, marking the success of the rite. From the darkness emerged a spectral figure who disdainfully noted the crude sigil and asked who had summoned him. Before the cultists stood a majestic, horned demon, demanding an answer from those who dared disturb his rest. Duke Ubar fell prostrate before the entity, declaring that they had awaited the great patron's arrival for an eternity. He complained about the overwhelming presence of God's followers and offered to surrender the entire human world to the demons in exchange for their dark power. The dark entity deemed the Duke's zeal commendable, observing his humbling bow with cold interest. The demon proclaimed the beginning of a great wave of evil that would soon devastate the human world. He promised to inform the Archduke of the demons that he now had loyal allies among mortals. Before disappearing into a cloud of black smoke, the demon demanded that loyalty be proven through action, promising Ubar immense power. Ubar's cultists went into a frenzy of excitement. They proclaimed the dawn of the era of evil and the imminent rule of their master over the entire world, believing that the world of Ubar was near. The devoted fanatics swore to demonstrate their unwavering loyalty to the great Archduke. Following Ubar's orders, they immediately began preparations for active operations, shouting slogans in the name of evil. In reality, the role of the great demon was expertly performed by Nibirius. After the ritual, he merely grumbled about his dusty cloak, while his partner confirmed that the disguise had worked flawlessly. Duke Ubar swallowed the bait completely, convinced that the summoning had succeeded. Velid's demons noted with satisfaction that this arrogant human had become a compliant puppet in their hands. Now all attention turned to Orobas. The demons needed to discover his secret recipe for the fake holy water before the banquet ended. Velid had already dispatched his best operatives for the task. At the villa, Velid, dressed in ceremonial uniform, watched his spouse intently. Noticing her tension, he asked Beryl directly if she was still feeling nervous. Beryl admitted that she was indeed uneasy before her official public appearance. She was struck by how quickly and accurately the Duke had discerned her inner state. It turned out that her anxiety was far too obvious to those around her. The Duke's allies merely confirmed that the saint was completely incapable of hiding her fear. Velid gently took his wife's hand, noting that whenever she feels anxious, she always clenches her hands tightly. With this gesture, he tried to calm Beryl and give her strength before entering the hall. Velid continued to study Beryl closely, noticing every little habit of hers. He observed how she nervously bit her lower lip whenever something troubled her. The man gently touched her face, adding that she also began to blink slowly during moments of intense anxiety. His perceptiveness made the saint even more flustered. Beryl tried to pull away, expressing her concerns. She feared that if their plan failed, the Vine family could be drawn into a dangerous conflict with the temple. Veled tried to reassure her, but she insisted on her point. She was genuinely worried that not only Orobas, but also Ubar had some hidden card to play at the temple, capable of turning the situation against them. The Duke decisively took his wife's hands, silencing her and compelling her to listen. He stated firmly that nothing of the sort would happen. Veled reminded Beryl of who they truly were, emphasizing that they were the real demons in this game. He explained that the clearer their enemies' desires became, the greater the advantage for demons, whose nature is intrinsically linked to and attuned with human passions. Meanwhile, Duke Orobas sat in his study, fuming with rage. He wondered why he had to keep offering tributes to the temple when they already possessed more wealth than he did. Orobas angrily recalled all the enormous bribes he had given the priests over the years. He resolved that his house would no longer allow the church to boss it around and dictate terms. House Orobas finally completed their secret weapon. They could now produce their own holy water. Duke Orobas established strict security protocols for the process. Rule number 1 stated that only necessary parts of the ancient method were to be transcribed to keep its essence a secret. Rule number 2 prohibited anything but the holy water itself from leaving the chamber. Any papers, books, or other materials had to remain behind closed doors. Finally, the very existence of the secret basement chamber was to remain a total secret. The Duke accepted the risks, believing it was the only way forward. The ingredient list was so bizarre that Orobas' subordinate doubted their success. He couldn't believe it was as simple as placing an empty bottle and praying for it to fill. The entire process seemed suspiciously simple, leaving him with a lingering sense of unease. Something about the method felt wrong. For Orobas himself, however, only the result mattered. Having memorized the recipe, he was now only waiting for the final wagon to arrive during the banquet. The Duke checked with his butler if everything was ready for the guests. The butler confirmed that preparations were proceeding exactly as instructed. Orobas ordered a check of today's wagon deliveries to ensure the monster carcasses were still fresh and had not begun to decompose. At the Orobas estate, work was in full swing. The butler reported to the Duke that 70 more wagons of monster carcasses were needed to meet today's quota. It turned out that delivering the remaining cargo would take about 2 days. This timing perfectly coincided with the start of the planned banquet, where Orobas intended to carry out his scheme. To prevent the raw materials from spoiling and emitting deadly poison, the servants were ordered to immediately store the delivered carcasses in the cold storage. The cook, hiding in the bushes, accidentally revealed himself with a loud snap of a branch. The warriors overseeing the process instantly froze, alert to the noise. The guards reacted immediately and spotted the fleeing man. Shouts erupted, and the soldiers rushed after the uninvited witness. Terrified, the cook ran with all his might, choking back tears. He cursed the moment he decided to follow the Duke's servants, realizing his life was hanging by a thread. The guards quickly identified the fugitive. Believing the cook to be a spy, they ordered all exits to be blocked, determined not to let him escape the estate alive. Hiding behind the corner of the manor, the miserable man trembled with fear. He realized his excessive curiosity had doomed him, even though he hadn't actually seen anything significant. The chase did not pause for a single moment. Orobas' soldiers were convinced the fugitive couldn't have gotten far, and they began to meticulously search every corridor of the castle. The cook choked back his terror, covering his mouth to avoid making a sound, while the pursuers scoured the castle for the spy. Suddenly, Ratley, the demon of fire who had infiltrated the Orobas residence on Veled's orders, appeared. He told the man to open his eyes, announcing they had lost the guards. Paralyzed with fear, the cook stared at the stranger, unable to comprehend who he was or how he had appeared in the guarded estate. Ratley unceremoniously grabbed the fugitive and confirmed if he was indeed the chef. Upon hearing the answer, the demon stated that his master had been looking for a chef. The man was struck with terror by such a forceful approach, completely confused as to why a powerful warrior would be interested in a lowly servant. The fire demon introduced himself as Ratley and made it clear that the cook's life now belonged to his master. He commanded the man to leave the Orobas territory immediately, promising to reveal all the details of the operation later. The cook argued in a panic that the whole place was crawling with guards and they should stay hidden until things quieted down. Ratley confidently claimed he had everything figured out. He snatched up the cook and sprinted away at incredible speed, deciding to burst right through the enemy's lines. The corridor fell silent. All around, only the shouts of the guards could be heard, unable to figure out where that damn rat had disappeared to. Meanwhile, the campfire in the forest flared up, burning brighter with renewed intensity. In the next moment, Ratley appeared from that very fire, carrying the cook on his shoulders. With a smirk, he said they had barely managed to leave the Orobas estate unnoticed. He hurried to rejoin the others, but upon reaching the rendezvous point, he found only emptiness. All the warriors of the Vine estate seemed to have vanished, leaving Ratley wondering if they would make it back to the manor in time. Suddenly, a familiar demon emerged from the bushes and asked what kind of rat Ratley had brought with him. In any case, he said it was time for them to return to the estate and inform Ranov that an entire horde of monsters was heading toward the Orobas estate. Meanwhile, life in the castle went on as usual. The maids were busy gossiping about the passionate relationship between the master and Beryl, discussing their recent privacy and the strict order not to go upstairs. A mysterious figure lurking around the corner watched the gossiping maids, and what he heard clearly did not please him. Suddenly, the sound of shattering dishes echoed through the hall of the estate. One of the maids had dropped a tray of cups filled with hot tea. A red-haired guard took the hit himself, shielding those around him. Despite the risk of a serious burn, he coldly stated he was fine and refused to see a physician. The man hurried away, citing an urgent matter with the Duke. Meanwhile, a mysterious figure in light-colored clothes quickly disappeared behind the corridor doors. The morning sun filled the villa's bedroom with soft light. The spouses were still in bed, enjoying rare moments of peace before the upcoming banquet. Velid was the first to stir, feeling Beryl's presence beside him. A soft sigh broke the morning silence of the luxurious chambers. A sleepy Beryl tenderly addressed her husband, worried that her waking up might have disturbed his rest. The Duke only gave a gentle smile while looking at his wife. He realized she was utterly exhausted after the events of the previous night, which lasted until dawn. Showing a tenderness unusual for demons, Velid told Beryl to sleep a little longer. He wanted her to regain her strength before her official public appearance. Velid kissed Beryl gently, trying to prolong the moments of their morning privacy. He hovered over her, completely consumed by his affection and unwilling to let her out of his embrace. The Duke noted that it was already morning and asked with slight concern if Beryl was truly okay with continuing their intimacy at such an hour. The girl touched his hand, admitting that a strange unease still lingered in her soul. She asked her husband to make her feel better and distract her from these oppressive thoughts. Velid didn't make her wait. He whispered that he would do as she wished and pulled her close again, ready to give her all his attention. However, their idyll was suddenly interrupted by a persistent knock at the door. A servant outside announced that an urgent message had arrived for his lordship, requiring an immediate response. Velid was extremely displeased with the interruption. His gaze instantly turned cold as he demanded an explanation for what could be so important as to disturb their peace. A startled Ranov stood at the door. He apologized for the intrusion, but emphasized that the monster situation had become critical and required the Duke's personal attention. The guard reported that a massive swarm of monsters was rapidly approaching the Orobas residence. Beryl, tightly wrapped in the covers, listened intently to the news, realizing that the time of quiet was over. Beryl could not suppress a gasp of horror upon hearing about the approaching monsters. The news of the monster invasion at such a critical moment caught her completely off guard. Ranov confirmed the worst fears. There were far too many monsters, and even Nibirius's elite squad was forced to retreat under their onslaught. It was revealed that the nobles were intentionally luring the creatures from all across the land, creating a threat of unprecedented proportions. Beryl struggled to find logic in the nobles' actions. She couldn't understand why noble families would risk so many lives and attract monsters to their own territories. Velid, maintaining his icy composure, explained the biology of these creatures to his wife. He reminded her that a monster's favorite thing to eat is concentrated magical power. It turned out that it had recently become trendy among the nobility to carry around items and trinkets infused with holy water. For humans, it was merely a superstition and a status symbol, but the consequences were fatal. Beryl quickly realized the irony of the situation. This protective trend was not only ineffective, but also made the nobles look like perfect prey in the eyes of hungry beasts. Veled added that holy water contains a massive concentration of power. To a monster, a person carrying such an amulet glows in the dark like the most tempting morsel. Beryl was struck by how tempting yet helpless these people appeared to the enemy. Fearing for the innocent, she suggested they immediately begin evacuating the residents. However, the nobles' true goal was far more cynical. They were intentionally taking this risk to slaughter as many monsters as possible. They needed fresh carcasses to manufacture fake holy water and triumphantly prove their sacredness at the upcoming banquet. There was less than a week left until the decisive banquet. Unlike the nobility with their holy charms, the common residents were relatively safe. The monsters simply ignored them. The plan to destroy the water production became complicated, as Orobas could have manufactured multiple batches in different locations simultaneously. The massive presence of knights and priests at the banquet created additional difficulties for conducting a covert operation. The Duke planned to secretly transport monster remains in coffins right under the nose of the Inquisition. Beryl recalled a key detail. The secret recipe for the fake water was never supposed to leave the walls of the hidden chamber. Renove confirmed her hunch, admitting that this was the most likely scenario for how things would unfold. If the priests caught Orobas turning monster carcasses into holy water, his reputation would be utterly destroyed. Beryl was convinced that the first batch of the fake was already prepared and would be used at the upcoming celebration. Beryl proposed a daring plan: to steal the already finished batch of the fake water. Left unprotected, Orobas would panic when the monsters, attracted by the magic, crashed right into the middle of his banquet. In the moment of chaos, when the Duke tried to restock and started bringing in new carcasses, Beryl planned to lead the priests directly to the place where the remains were being processed. Renove admitted that this strategy could work. The plan was approved for execution. To bring several wagons of cargo into the basement, Orobas would have to leave the gates open, giving the group a perfect chance to infiltrate. A technical difficulty arose. Demons cannot touch holy water. To steal the fake, they needed someone who would not be harmed by contact with the temple's energy. Veled understood that for such a complex operation to succeed, they would require serious support and outside help. The Orobas estate glowed in the rays of the setting sun, preparing to host the most influential people in the empire. The celebration began with an exchange of fake pleasantries. Priests and nobility showered each other with blessings, hiding their true motives behind masks of piety. The Orobas family lined up knights to meet the temple delegation. The hosts declared the house's full readiness for inspection, while the church representatives expressed hypocritical gratitude for the welcome. One of the knights observed Orobas with disdain, noting his desperate and hypocritical attempts to appear sacred in the eyes of others. He was frustrated that his daily prayers brought him no divine power, while rumors of the sudden appearance of true holy water began to circulate throughout the castle. The servants in the corridors whispered about a mysterious, bright glow that could be mistaken for nothing other than authentic grace. One of the maids confirmed the suspicions, stating she recognized the substance due to her connections with the priesthood and pointed to the basement as its storage place. Overhearing this conversation, the undercover agent realized that the basement held Orobas's main secret and vulnerability. With a sinister grin, the informant locked in the target. The existence of the water in the basement was no longer a secret to the House of Baine. The reconnaissance group safely returned to the estate, having completed their dangerous intelligence gathering in the enemy's lair. The maids shared their impressions of how exhilarating and risky it was to be surrounded by paladins without revealing their true nature. Folklore noted the main irony of the situation. The vaunted holy knights and priests turned out to be completely blind, failing to sense demons right under their noses. Beryl asked about the success of the mission, to which Veled expressed confidence that Clayda was definitely not there, which significantly eased their task. Carabia confirmed she was ready, while Folklore laughingly added that a power-hungry official immediately took the bait they had offered him. Beryl sincerely thanked her allies for their invaluable help. In response, the demoness admitted she hadn't had this much fun with intrigues in a very long time. The decisive moment arrived, and Veled announced the start of the operation. Beryl ordered all supporters to be in full readiness for the upcoming events. Luxurious carriages began arriving at the Orobas estate, marking the beginning of a grand celebration that was meant to change everything. The halls filled with the sparkle of chandeliers and the hum of social talk, as unsuspecting guests discussed the latest gossip. A loud herald's voice interrupted the conversations, solemnly announcing the arrival of the main guests, the Duke and Duchess of Baine. The crowd froze in amazement, eager to finally see the mysterious couple and find out if the legendary sacred lady was truly before them. Beryl's outfit caused a wave of shock among the nobility. No one expected the humble saint to choose such a provocatively extravagant and expensive gown for her appearance. Beryl shocked the guests by choosing a mourning black outfit for her appearance, which completely defied the crowd's expectations of seeing a saint in a traditional light-colored dress. Meanwhile, at the Baine family villa, the maids were in confusion. One of them thought she saw a priest walk past, although no official notices of temple visits had been received. A distinct foul smell emanated from the blonde man in shining robes spotted at the estate, contrasting with his noble and pure appearance. The events shifted back 30 minutes earlier to the main banquet hall of the Orobas family, where the reception was just beginning. Duke Orobas welcomed the high-ranking church officials with feigned delight, reminding them of the promise he had made in the invitation letter. The priests wasted no time and directly asked the Duke if he was ready to confirm his non-involvement with demons and prove his holiness before all the guests. Looking at the temple big shot, the Duke felt nothing but contempt, considering this high-ranking cleric to be merely a pampered pretty boy, far from true faith. Orobas confirmed that the Orobas family would demonstrate their holiness during the main event of the evening, leaving no room for doubt. The housemaster's self-assured tone intrigued those present, and one of the guests directly inquired what exactly gave the Duke such unwavering confidence in success. 3 families suspected of being the House of the Devil became the center of attention: Ubar, Orobas, and Baine. Previously, the sacred Lady Beryl had officially pointed to the Baine family as the cradle of evil. However, despite the saint's accusations, no direct evidence or official word of a demon being found in the Baine house had ever surfaced. Duke Orobas fully understood the political subtext. If he publicly proved his holiness at this gathering, the suspicion would finally fall entirely on his rivals. Orobas' success would mean ruin for Duke Ubar, putting him in an extremely difficult and dangerous position before the Inquisition. But behind Ubar's outward calm lay his own dark plans that ran contrary to the interests of the temple. Memories of a secret deal surfaced. A mysterious hooded figure promised to let the Archduke of the Demons know that he had loyal men among the humans. The dark entity demanded proof of loyalty from the cultists, promising in return to bestow great power beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Ubar was obsessed with the thought of his coming triumph, believing that soon all his enemies would grovel at the feet of his demonic patron. Returning to the reality of the banquet, Orobas fueled the public's interest by stating that he would present undeniable proof of his holiness only during the main event. The host of the ball, Duke Orobas, maintained outward calm, deciding to wait until every single guest had convened before proceeding with his plan. The herald officially announced the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Baine, pinning the gazes of all the gathered aristocracy upon them. A murmur of amazement instantly swept through the guests. Elderly noble ladies were shocked by such a spectacular and daring appearance of the couple. Beryl looked dazzling in her new black dress, which emphasized her new status and final break from the temple's ascetic rules. Veled showed exceptional tenderness toward his wife, gently supporting her arm and reminding her in a quiet whisper that there was no need to rush and she should move carefully. Rumors began to circulate through the hall. People whispered that the saint had indeed dared to arrive in black, and the cold Duke Baine was smiling sincerely for the first time in their memory. The nobility were in complete confusion, refusing to believe that this femme fatale was the same sacred lady whose purity the temple had always praised. Noticing Beryl's intense nervousness, Veled solicitously seated her on a sofa and promised to personally fetch drinks to give her a chance to compose herself in this hostile environment. Those around were struck by the trepidation and reverence with which the stern Duke treated his wife, even though many expected him to be furious due to the demon label. The guests continued to gossip, claiming that Veled was only being courteous to Beryl to deflect suspicion and prove he had no connection to demons. One of the attendees approached the couple and familiarly greeted the sacred lady, noting that it had been a very long time since they last met. Beryl recognized the speaker at once and began to respond, trying to remain composed under the watchful eyes of her detractors. The rumors in the hall did not cease. The priests venomously discussed her revealing outfit, stating she had been completely tainted by secular life and could no longer return to the temple's asceticism. The insults toward his wife threw Velid into a rage. He was ready to lash out at the offenders on the spot. But Beryl intervened just in time, pleading with her husband to stop. The clergymen went even further in their hypocrisy, calling her behavior shameless and openly musing that the sacred lady required forced re-education. Veled's face contorted into a terrifying, bone-chilling smirk. The fury inside him was boiling over, promising those present a swift and brutal retribution. The Duke coldly addressed the whispering priests, caustically noting that the servants of God were showing a suspiciously keen and inappropriate interest in another man's wife. Stepping forward and resolutely shielding Beryl, Velid openly threatened the guests with unfortunate consequences and advised them to leave immediately while he still possessed the remnants of his patience. The priests were outraged by Velid's audacity, but did not dare to enter into open conflict and preferred to retreat hastily, trying to save face before the other guests. Beryl carefully studied the faces of the present cult followers and, to her concern, discovered that their most dangerous opponent, Inquisitor Cleda, was not among them. The saint realized that everything happening in the hall was merely a distraction, and the priests of the temple actually had a completely different, much darker plan. Sensing a growing threat, the couple decided to leave the banquet immediately and return to their Vine Country estate as soon as possible. Upon their return, a violent storm caught them. The pouring rain and flashes of lightning over the villa only intensified the oppressive premonition of disaster. At the entrance, they were met by a terrified guard who, despite the downpour, rushed toward the Duke, shouting for help. Stepping out of the carriage, Velid first demanded a report on Ronov's whereabouts, and heard in response that something terrible had happened at the estate in his absence. The subordinates reported that as soon as the ducal couple left for the celebration, priests raided the villa and, under the pretext of interrogation, forcibly took Ronov away in an unknown direction. The name of the person who led this seizure confirmed Beryl's worst fears. The abductor turned out to be the fanatical prelate Cleda himself. Beryl furiously demanded immediate clarification of the place where the Inquisitors had taken his loyal assistant. The maid, trembling with fear, replied that she had seen the priests drag Ronove straight to the estate's basement under escort. The girl expressed serious concern about whether her ladyship should go down there alone, fearing for her safety. She suggested calling Duke Baine immediately so that he could personally intervene in the situation and protect Beryl. Beryl categorically refused, explaining that this meeting was too dangerous for Velid, and it made the most sense for her, as the sacred lady, to stand against the prelate. She told the maid to act quickly and save Ronov at all costs, while she herself took over the negotiations with the temple. Meanwhile, in the gloomy basement, Ronove, deprived of strength and bound by magic, knelt before his tormentor. Cleda, standing over him, mockingly inquired if the demon really didn't remember their recent meeting on the third floor of the estate. The Inquisitor reminded him in detail of the morning bell and the chance encounter with the maids, making it clear that he had uncovered Renov's essence much earlier than he had expected. Renove realized the situation was taking a bad turn and continued to deny everything, pretending he didn't recall a thing. Cleda stepped close and, with a caustic smirk, reminded him of the incident with the boiling water that a maid had accidentally splashed on the Duke's aide's shoulder that morning. The Inquisitor pointed out the complete absence of burn marks on Renov's skin, even though a brown tea stain was still clearly visible on his collar. But Cleda wasn't finished. He leaned in, almost to the demon's face, deciding to play his main trump card. He whispered that at the moment of their chance encounter, he had smelled an absolutely vile, unholy scent coming from Ronove that betrayed his true essence. Renove realized that this man was dangerously perceptive and was likely the very fanatic Miss Beryl had warned him about. Yet he still tried to dismiss it all as a misunderstanding. The other priests insistently demanded the prisoner be immediately transported to the temple for interrogation, fearing that Duke Baine and the Sacred Lady could return to the estate at any moment. The prelate agreed, reminding his subordinates that the Sacred Lady herself had chosen the Baine family as the target of her investigation, to expose them as the true lair of the devil. With chilling composure, Cleda stated that they were not committing a crime, but were merely carrying out the Sacred Lady's will without question. A loud knock on the basement door resounded, making the temple priests flinch and interrupt their interrogation. Beryl appeared in the doorway. Her majestic silhouette in the dungeon's gloom made the Inquisitors freeze in surprise. The Inquisitors were shocked by the sudden visit, but Beryl coldly reminded them that this was her home, and she required no one's permission to enter. Resolutely stepping deeper into the room, the Sacred Lady stood before Ronov and demanded a clear explanation from those present about what was going on. The priests accompanying the prelate cried out in panic that this man was likely a demon, but Beryl commanded them to step aside with an authoritative gesture. Standing up for the Duke's aide, she defiantly asked Claydagh if he truly believed that she, the Sacred Lady, would be unable to recognize a demon. A heavy silence fell over the basement. Beryl directly asked the Inquisitor if his unauthorized actions were a sign that the temple no longer trusted her word and abilities. Claydagh did not back down and presented a compelling argument. He had personally seen boiling water splashed on the man's right shoulder, yet he didn't even flinch, and not a single mark remained on his skin. The prelate added that he had seen Ronov on the first floor shortly before. No mortal knight could have covered the distance to the third floor with such incredible, supernatural speed. Inquisitor Claydagh stood his ground, stating that the suspect had to be taken to the temple for a holiness test. He considered the lack of a burn on the skin sufficient grounds for arrest and further interrogation. Beryl showed no sign of fear. On the contrary, she accepted the challenge and began her counterattack with a calm, almost frightening confidence. At that moment, Carabia suddenly appeared in the dungeon, terrifying the priests with her silent arrival. The churchmen could not understand how she had entered the secured room undetected. The Sacred Lady announced that she would resolve this lingering misunderstanding herself. She authoritatively ordered Carabia to immediately fetch another servant from her private quarters. Beryl clearly specified the requirement. The priests were to be presented with Renov's brother, who actually bore a mark from a severe burn on his right shoulder. The girl looked at the Inquisitor with a hidden smirk. She decided to use his own perceptiveness against him, creating a perfect alibi for her aide. Carabia, having received instructions, immediately dashed out of the basement. She raced through the manor's corridors, realizing that the success of the entire rescue operation for Ronov now depended on her speed. Upon reaching one of the rooms, she encountered Veled, who was anxiously waiting for news. Seeing the breathless maid, he demanded an immediate report on the situation in the dungeon. Gasping for breath from running, the girl explained that Ronov was being interrogated, but Lady Beryl had intervened just in time. She relayed the order to find a brother with a real burn on his shoulder to completely baffle the Inquisitors. Veled appreciated Beryl's resourcefulness, finding her plan quite impressive. He quickly grasped the essence of her trick and acknowledged that coming up with such a clever scheme in so little time was no small feat. The demon ordered the maid to get Renov's decoy brother ready at once. Meanwhile, Beryl's decisive actions in the dungeon triggered panic and protests among the Inquisitors. Assisting Renove, she whispered for him to feign excruciating pain, promising to personally vouch for him before the temple. Claydagh roughly grabbed the Sacred Lady's shoulder, accusing her of a pathetic attempt to deceive the priests with tales of a brother. At that moment, Veled appeared in the basement, his cold voice making the prelate immediately interrupt his tirade. The Inquisitor condescendingly noted that Beryl was too naive to understand the true weight of her deceitful words. Veled's gaze darkened with fury as he directly questioned which lowly priest dared to defile his spouse with his touch. The appearance of Renov's double left the Inquisitors in a state of utter paralysis. Veled asked with cold contempt if the priests weren't overstepping their bounds by trying to give orders in his estate. Claydagh froze in bewilderment, refusing to believe the reality unfolding before his eyes. Beryl watched her enemy's reaction triumphantly, knowing her ruse had worked flawlessly. Renov's twin brother appeared before the clergyman, his appearance raising no suspicion of a demonic nature. Duke Baine officially presented both men, completely stripping the Inquisitors of any solid ground. The decoy servant politely greeted those present, introducing himself as the Duchess's personal aide. Beryl confirmed the identity of Renov's brother, skillfully using the created illusion to protect her people. The temple priests finally fell for the deception, attributing the spectacle to the rare resemblance of twin brothers. Beryl explained to the Inquisitors that she called the servants brother only because they were deeply mistaken in their suspicions. The saint added that a visual demonstration is always more effective than long and useless explanations, which she had no intention of providing. Velid pulled his spouse to him in an intimate and protective gesture, emphasizing their unbreakable bond before their enemies. Inquisitor Cleda stood in complete shock, unable to admit the sudden defeat of his plan. The prelate continued to watch the couple intently, looking for even the slightest flaw in their behavior to regain control of the situation. The Duke jealously reminded Beryl that her husband was always near and watched her closely, to which she bashfully asked him to behave decently in front of witnesses. An outraged Cleda called their behavior lewd and unworthy, demanding they immediately stop this inappropriate spectacle. The prelate venomously noted that he had never taught the sacred lady to behave so debauched and shamelessly in front of others. Veled's eyes flashed with a dangerous green flame. He sharply cut him off, stating that the former teacher had no right to tell his wife how to behave in her own home. Realizing the situation had turned against him, Cleda was forced to admit he had overstepped. Beryl coldly noted that she understood his zeal for demon hunting, but it should not go so far as tormenting innocent people. She added that she was aware of the suspicions surrounding the Vine family, but never expected such barbaric treatment. Veled reminded the Inquisitor that he had invaded his home without warning and dragged his people into the basement, questioning the manners of the temple's representatives. Seeing the irrefutable evidence of his failure, the prelate was forced to openly admit his grave mistake. To hush up the incident, Cleda promised that the temple would prepare generous reparations for the damage caused. Beryl was genuinely amazed at how quickly this arrogant man admitted his defeat and bowed to the circumstances. However, this did not satisfy Veled. He furiously pointed out that the prelate had still not apologized for his crude touch on his wife. Broken by the pressure, Cleda fell prostrate and humbly begged the Lord for forgiveness for his inexcusable insolence. Cleda, realizing the complete failure of his inspection, was forced to bow his head and beg for forgiveness, justifying his audacity with blind devotion to God's plan. Beryl magnanimously accepted the apology, officially forgiving the prelate for his inappropriate rudeness and intrusion into the ducal couple's private space. However, the sacred lady set a strict condition for the future, forbidding the Inquisition from appearing at the estate without warning or showing even the slightest disrespect. She coldly warned that if the boundaries were violated again, the temple would have to pay too high a price for its arrogance. Later, in the quiet setting of the bedroom, Beryl admitted that the situation had been critical and thanked her husband for managing to overcome the threat together. Veled disagreed with his spouse, insisting that the estate's salvation was solely the result of her brilliant mind and her ability to instantly adapt to circumstances. The demonic chalice was now completely safe under the Duke's protection, becoming a symbol of their first major victory over the temple. A moment ago, Folklore materialized in the study, finding the intrigue played out before the Inquisitors incredibly amusing and exciting. The demoness confirmed her readiness to continue helping, recognizing Beryl as a truly brilliant mistress whose orders she would carry out with special pleasure. As soon as Folklore finished her business and disappeared in a cloud of smoke, Ranov suggested that everyone should finally disperse. Finding themselves in the privacy of the bedroom, the Duke laughingly recalled how Folklore continued walking around with Ranov's face even after the last priest had left the estate. Beryl noted that his sister seemed to genuinely enjoy her little game and the turmoil she had caused among the Inquisitors. Beryl admitted that the sight of the real Renove, who was frantically pleading with her to stop and not use his appearance anymore, seemed incredibly hilarious to her. Veled feigned indignation, noting that his spouse was smiling so radiantly while thinking of another man, even if it was just her loyal aide. The man moved closer, and the atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from playful to intimate and tense. Beryl blushed deeply under his intense gaze, not knowing how to answer his question about whether she could smile even more beautifully for him. The playful tone vanished completely as Veled leaned toward her, intending to seal their bond with a passionate kiss. That night, they completely surrendered to their feelings, forgetting the temple's schemes and the dangers of the outside world in each other's arms. Under the cover of night on the Orobas estate, a triumphant laugh rang out. One of the temple knights had discovered the stash and couldn't believe that the legendary holy water actually existed. Blinded by greed, the man clutched the coveted flask and documents to himself, convinced that this priceless treasure now belonged to him alone. Ratley watched this scene from the shadows with a mocking smirk, enjoying how easily the humans swallowed the bait prepared by the Vine couple. Having made sure the provocation succeeded, the general walked confidently through the corridors to reunite with his partner. Upon finding Ranov, Ratley gleefully reported that their plan had worked flawlessly. The foolish knight stole the holy water exactly as they predicted, leaving not a single drop. Ratley appreciated the operation's success and was about to rush to the Duke to report the mission's completion. However, at the last moment, Ranove abruptly stopped Ratley, blocking his path with his palm and making it clear that now was not the most appropriate time to visit their master. Ratley froze in utter surprise, not understanding why they should delay such important and joyful news. Ratley expressed concerns about the start of the main banquet, but Ranov remained completely confident in their success. He decided to deliver the important message himself, allowing the general to leave his post and attend to his own business. Meanwhile, in the chambers, Veled began to show persistence, ignoring Beryl's timid protests regarding the safety of her outfit. The girl seriously feared that her husband might ruin the expensive dress prepared specifically for the gala appearance. Beryl reminded him that their banquet costumes were designed as a single set, emphasizing their status as an inseparable couple. Veled leaned over her authoritatively, making it clear that the official part of the evening was secondary to him right now. The spouse admitted that ruining such an exquisite outfit would be a great loss, but her husband was overwhelmed by feelings he no longer wished to restrain. Therefore, he searched for a way to combine his passion with the need to look flawless at the ball. Veled carefully lowered the edge of the dress from Beryl's shoulder, promising to be extremely gentle and not cause her any harm. He sought to enjoy the final moments of their privacy before they had to face the crowd of schemers. Beryl was in deep confusion, realizing that the time before the start of the ceremony was rapidly slipping away. She covered her face with her hands, torn between her sense of duty to the estate and her own growing desire. Veled looked intently into her eyes and directly asked if she truly wanted to stop now. His voice was soft and persuasive, and his gaze expressed absolute confidence in the answer he expected to receive. Instead of unnecessary words, Beryl simply gave her husband a gentle smile, finally casting aside all doubts and fears. That look became a silent signal to the Duke that their private time had not yet come to an end. Duke Baine responded with an understanding gaze filled with sincere affection and love. He ultimately decided that no state affairs or banquets were worth interrupting such a precious moment of intimacy. Veled decided not to waste a single minute and suggested they hurry so that their absence wouldn't raise suspicion among the banquet organizers. They spent the final moments of their privacy in passionate embraces, sealing their alliance before the upcoming trial in the enemy camp. Meanwhile, Ranov impatiently checked his pocket watch, noting that he had never in his life looked forward to a banquet so much. In the main hall, guests were actively discussing Prelate Cleda's statement that the temple would in no way assist Duke Orobas in proving his holiness. Soon, Duke Orobas himself appeared in the doorway. He walked accompanied by his knights, trying to maintain a majestic and unshakable appearance. Those present noticed Cleda's foul mood, understanding the reason for his anger. If Orobas proves his purity, the list of suspects linked to the devil will narrow down to the Vine and Eubar families. Veled solicitously asked Beryl how she was feeling, to which she replied that thanks to her past life experience, she felt almost no fear today. The Duke and Duchess of Vine majestically entered the hall, demonstrating their unity and confidence in their own righteousness to those around them. Surveying the crowd, Beryl noted that this time, far more evaluating and hostile eyes were fixed upon them than ever before. The lad kept his eyes fixed on his wife and admitted that everyone's attention was drawn to her only because she was exceedingly beautiful that evening. The guests in the hall began to whisper, noticing the spark between the spouses. The aristocrats concluded that this marriage was clearly not a mere formality or a boring duty to the temple. The Duke solicitously escorted Beryl to a place of honor, suggesting she sit down, while she politely thanked those around her. Noticing a shadow of concern on his wife's face, Veled leaned toward her and whispered that she looked far too solemn and serious at that moment. Beryl was forced to take back her previous words about remaining calm and honestly admitted to her husband that her nerves were still on edge due to the hostile environment. A sudden cry from the herald interrupted their conversation. The hall officially announced the arrival of the master of the estate, Duke Orobas, whose appearance was met with a flurry of whispers among the guests. Those present froze in shock, unable to understand what was happening. Whispers of horror swept through the crowd as the guests witnessed something they had not expected from this appearance. Beryl was the first to notice something was wrong and urged Belith to look closely at Duke Orobas, to which her husband curtly confirmed that he saw the irregularities as well. Duke Orobas himself appeared before the guests, his appearance raising concerns about his health. It was evident that the Duke was in quite a rush,